I will begin quietly, as a good host draws back a curtain before the first light enters. Think of a seaside hotel in mid-season, the carpets already carrying the salt breath of August, the brass polished before dawn, the staff moving like a practiced orchestra. I was that orchestra's conductor. My name is Mr. Stringer, and the reputation of the Excelsior was the reputation of my own bones. I knew every bell and hinge. I knew which step in the grand staircase complained, and which lamp in the writing room flickered at the slightest draught. I believed in order, and order depended on vigilance, no shouting, no fuss. Above all, no mice. A hotel may forgive a chipped saucer, never a rodent. So, on the morning in question, I tightened my tie and gave the day its first command. Nothing unexpected. The sea, of course, never obeys a hotelier. It sends in guests the way it sends in tides. That morning brought a boy with a thoughtful face and a Norwegian grandmother with eyes as bright as the Channel. She smoked a small cigar that left a ribbon of spicy scent, the kind that clings politely and then refuses to leave. They asked for a room with a view and hot water that did not hesitate. She had a walking stick and a way of noticing corners. He had the earnestness of the very young, and a habit of listening to silence as if it were speaking. I watched them sign the register and felt the minute shift that accompanies true arrivals. I remember the other party even more keenly. They had reserved the ballroom under a charitable title that promised worthy discussions and sensible sandwiches. Their leader sent notes on hotel letterhead demanding privacy, punctuality, and a strict ban on children in the vicinity of their meeting. I obliged, as I always do, and yet I noticed gloves at wrists. When the weather asked for none, hats that rested too heavily on the head, and a constant murmur about itching. Hotel men notice patterns. We do not guess. We observe. Later, I walked through the dining room and adjusted the place cards for luncheon. I watched the waiters rehearse the route from kitchen to table and made them practice corners until the soup could travel without shivering. The boy lingered in the lounge, studying the chessboard with the sort of attention that wins games in the mind. The grandmother's book lay open, but she looked beyond it, toward the ballroom doors. It is a curious truth that certain guests bring with them the sensation of a story already begun. A hotel merely supplies the chapters. The first knock on order came at 11, when the chambermaid reported a complaint from the second floor. The charitable ladies had chastised her for the faintest whiff of carpet shampoo, then asked if we kept the windows painted shut. She said she saw lines on their scalps where hair ought to grow. She whispered and fluttered in a way I discourage. I assured her that every window opened, that our shampoos were approved by all sensible noses, and that we do not discuss the private grooming of guests. Calm in a manager is as useful as a safe in a bank. I completed my rounds, straightening trivially crooked things and filing them back into the invisible drawer called standards. In the card room, an elderly gentleman dozed beneath a portrait of the bay. In the writing room, a journalist I half recognized sharpened a pencil as though it were a weapon. The kitchen clanged with lunchtime, the glorious bell of industry, and I tasted the soup to confirm its civility. Everything was precise. It is possible to feel pride as a physical steadiness, as if one were walking upon boards laid by one's own care. Then the boy's grandmother requested a word with me. She asked with unruffled courtesy whether our hotel had ever suffered any trouble with witches. She said the word with such clarity that it landed in the air like a dropped teacup. I examined her face for mischief and found none. I told her that our establishment had never suffered trouble with anything that could not be entered in a logbook and resolved by tea and proper conduct. She thanked me with a look that felt like a test I had not studied for. When she left, her cigar left its ribbon on the corridor, and the corridor felt altered. I confess that the charitable ladies preoccupied me. Their gloves remained even when they fanned themselves. They scratched behind their ears with secretive jerks. They complained of draughts that did not exist and warmth that did. They moved like a flock, and yet they did not flock with affection. Their leader, a tall woman with a stance of command, surveyed the ballroom with a military eye and asked about the strength of the doors. She wanted them shut without hope of eavesdropping. She asked whether the kitchens were secure. She asked the sort of questions that suggest a recipe far more serious than sandwiches. I reminded myself that my duty was not to interpret, but to deliver. The chairs were aligned into perfect rows, water jugs replenished, dais dusted, and a neat sign erected outside the ballroom in a moderate font. This is what it is to be a manager. One smooths the surface over whatever currents run beneath. Yet I could not unhear the housemaid, nor could I unsee the way that boy paused near the ballroom doors, the way a cat sits when it detects something a human cannot. The grandmother returned after luncheon and observed, in that same tone that accepts no evasion, that the ladies wore wigs. I said that many fashionable women do, especially when travelling. She remarked upon the rashes and the constant scratching, and told me, like a nurse delivering a diagnosis, that sensitive skin may be a sign of something else entirely. She did not say the word again, but it vibrated in the space between us. I asked if everything in her room was to her liking. She said the view was excellent and the kettle obedient. She said the sea in this town smells braver than other seas. I do not know what that means, but I admired the way she made the air feel more precise. After she left, I wrote a single line in my incident book. Charitable ladies prefer closed windows. I keep such notes without commentary. Yet my mind returned to the ballroom, to the way the leader's eyes had swept over the ceiling, as if judging whether voices could climb through plaster. I had the sudden, foolish thought that if a mouse crept along the skirting board during their meeting, our reputation would fall 100 feet. I told the porter to double-check every trap. I reminded the staff to move with quiet efficiency. When a storm threatens, the first duty is to still the china. Evening approached, bringing with it the change in the hotel's heartbeat that always stirs me. Lamps took fire in their globes. The sea darkened into a sheet of ink, and the band rehearsed a timid waltz in the music room. I stood at the threshold of the ballroom and listened. There was silence, but the kind that presses back when touched. My hand lingered on the handle. I thought of the boy and his grandmother, of the leader with her commanding posture, of the tidy sign that told the world a wholesome story, and how often wholesome stories need the heaviest doors. I did not open them. A man in my position chooses when not to know. Here is a small truth from my trade. A hotel stands on rituals. Fresh lilies in the lobby. a folded corner of the breakfast paper. The promise that the day will be reasonable. Most guests come seeking the comfort of a predictable world. Yet there are days when a different world checks in under a moderate name. On those days, a manager earns his keep by smiling at the ordinary and preparing for the extraordinary without saying so. You put the extra sauces within reach. You tighten the bolts on the expected, and then you listen for the hinge that has never spoken before. I wish I could say that my unease was only superstition. It was not. But that belongs to later pages. For now I will tell you only that I stood in the dim of the corridor and thought about the word the grandmother had pronounced without blinking. I thought about the gloves, the wigs, the scratching, the airtight doors, and the insistence on privacy. I thought about the boy, and how he seemed to learn always toward the next corner, as if the future were speaking from there. And I thought about reputations, the fragile currency of a place like mine. We polish them with brass and soup tureens, yet one rumour can undo 100 gleams. But we still wonder whether order can ever hold when secrets insist on being discovered. We still wonder whether a manager's duty is to protect his house from the truth, or to lead the truth carefully through the front door and offer it a chair. Life seldom gives the courtesy of choosing. It simply delivers the next guest, and then another. Take a breath with me. Not everything that troubles a place is wicked. Some days are only complicated. You brew an extra pot of tea. You let the band take a longer break. You remind yourself that humans carry their storms discreetly, and that even storms sometimes pass without breaking the roof. Yet I could feel a weather gathering that was not in the sky. It had reserved the ballroom, shut the doors, and asked for silence. I smoothed my tie and made my way down the corridor to begin the evening service, convinced that nothing unexpected would occur, and equally certain that I was wrong. Morning returns to a hotel like a tide polishing last night's footprints, and I resumed my rounds with the calm of habit. The bellboys swept the sand from the steps. The chambermaids freshened the rooms with brisk, optimistic movements. The breakfast room rang with teaspoons and the soft newspaper crackle of English confidence. It should have been an ordinary day. Yet certain guests alter the temperature of a lobby simply by passing through it. And the boy with the thoughtful brow and his Norwegian grandmother did exactly that. They were unhurried without being idle. He scanned corners the way a chess player studies diagonals, and she, with her walking stick and steady breath, examined people rather than furniture. I had a memo from the ballroom party, a request that underscored what I already knew. Absolute privacy, no staff entering except to pour water at precisely spaced intervals, no children within earshot of the doors. Their title, charitable to the point of dullness, asked to be believed. Their habits asked not to be. I sent the maintenance man to add fresh bulbs in the corridor there, and checked every latch. A manager knows that light is a kind of argument. We persuade by brightness. It was in the writing room that I encountered my first true interruption of order. The boy sat at a low table by the ferns, his fingers busy with a spool of string and a matchbox of grains. 2 small white mice, bright as commas, whiskered at the edge of the tablecloth. They were tidy animals, I admit. They washed their faces with fastidious paws and blinked at me with the dignity of princes. But a hotel cannot host mice any more than a bank may host counterfeiters. Instinct moved me before kindness could interfere. I approached with the stride that refuses debate. I told him that rodents were strictly forbidden on the premises. He rose at once, as polite as a handwritten RSVP, and said he was training them to perform on a tightrope fashioned from his string. I saw the twine stretched between sugar bowls, and, despite myself, admired the ingenuity. He promised they would not run loose. Promises from children are like sea breezes. They cool the face, but move nothing heavy. I explained the rule once more, gently but firmly. He glanced toward the corridor as if measuring how fast a secret could run. When the grandmother arrived, she did not apologize. She regarded me steadily, as though weighing my character and my health together. She asked whether I preferred problems to present themselves in the open or to scuttle in the dark. It was not the question I expected. I answered, professional to the last, that the Excelsior preferred no problems at all. She nodded, as if I had told a joke with a bleak centre, and asked if I had ever seen an infestation solved by pretending it did not exist. She reached for the mice with careful hands, murmuring to them with the authority of a field nurse. I felt, absurdly, that the small creatures respected her. I held my ground. The lounge is a place for letters and tea, not rehearsals. She requested permission to let the boy continue for 1 more hour, until the ballroom was truly in use. I weighed the reputational calculus that every manager does in his head, the risk in allowing, the annoyance in forbidding, the sympathy that arrives uninvited when a grandmother and a small hope share a table. I granted the hour. I made it official by setting my watch 2 minutes slow, which is how hotel men write compassion into a timetable. The charitable ladies moved past us then, a current of perfume and conviction. Gloves, wigs, the faint redness where a wig meets skin, shoes that looked oddly square at the toes. They eyed the mice with a coldness that could season steel, and then looked at me as if I were the true violation. Their leader, the tall one, with the posture of a statue about to speak, paused to examine a fleck of dust on the skirting board that had escaped our mourning. She did not point, she willed me to see it. I did. I saw everything she wished seen, and almost nothing of what she wished concealed. Later in the service corridor, the barman told me one of the ladies had asked whether our soaps contained almond or marzipan fragrance. It seemed an odd question until he recalled that children's pastilles sometimes carry such a scent. The chambermaid, braver by gossip than she was by housekeeping, declared she had heard the word formula through the ballroom door, something about a delayed action. I stopped that talk with a single look. Staff should report facts, not embroidery. Yet even facts can fray a calm when they tug the right threads. At luncheon, the boy and his grandmother appeared again. The mice were absent, but the boy's attention strayed corridorward as if tethered by an invisible string. He ate with quick, dutiful bites. She ate slowly, as if instructing time to behave. When the pudding came, she pushed it away and asked whether the ballroom's doors were guaranteed against drafts. I told her they were. She inquired whether a child could accidentally slip inside if he were not careful. I assured her that our porters were careful for him. She thanked me with the smallest nod, and I felt, oddly, like I had been entered on a list. Hotels invite metaphors because they're already made of them. A corridor is a sentence. A door is a clause. A key is punctuation. You know you've kept a place well when the paragraphs of the day read smoothly. That afternoon, however, the syntax began to stutter. A junior waiter reported that one of the ladies had visited the kitchen and asked to observe the soup. Asked to observe the soup. She wore gloves, he said, around boiling pots. She stood very close and smiled without showing warmth. The chef, a principled man who trusts only butter and discipline, ordered her out. She left a sense of calculation hanging in the air like steam that refuses to vanish. As I walked the mezzanine, I passed the ballroom at the exact moment a laugh burst from inside, high and collective, not merry. It was the kind of sound you hear when a trick has succeeded among conspirators. I stood for 3 seconds too long. My hand hovered over the handle and then withdrew. Managers do not intrude upon paid-for privacy unless water is rising or smoke is visible. And yet I saw in my mind's impoliteness children's sweets wrapped in paper, a bottle with a foreign label, a timetable pinned on the inside of a skull. In the quiet that followed, the boy reappeared at the far end of the corridor, moving with exaggerated casualness. He had the look of someone drawn by a magnet he pretends not to feel. I held him with a stare, and he stopped. We stood, polite adversaries, two guardians of two different kinds of order. I told him there were stories in this world that do not let boys end them well, especially when those boys go where they are told not to go. He replied that some stories end worse when no one listens at all. I sent him back to the lounge with a firmness I usually reserve for drunkenness, and he went, though his attention went on without him. There are professions in which a person is rewarded for noticing what others miss. Ours is one of them. A flicker in the kitchen ledger, an extra laundry bag for a room that never swims, a group whose shoes have the blunt fronts of boxes, a whiff of something sharp and medicinal when the only advertised activity is benevolence, a child's longing braided with a grandmother's certainty. None of these is proof. Together they are weather. But we still wonder whether our duty to order blinds us to certain alarms that do not ring like bells, whether the habit of courtesy can be a velvet curtain over a precipice. We still wonder whether protecting a place from scandal ever protects it from harm. If you run a house long enough, you learn small acts of easing the air. You invent a cheerful errand for a nervous porter. You tell the pianist to favor waltzes with long, forgiving phrases. You spend 2 minutes talking about nothing with the chef, because kitchens take their courage from their leader's face. Life is often nothing worse than a knot that yields to patient fingers. And yet, passing the closed doors of the ballroom, I felt a knot that asked for a knife. The hour I had granted the boy had passed. I found him in the lounge, the string coiled, the sugar bowls back in the respectable company of cups. The mice peered from his pocket, twin secrets behaving themselves for the moment. I told him I would not mention them again, provided they never appeared between tablecloth and toast. He thanked me with a seriousness that belongs to vows. Then the grandmother approached, tapped her stick lightly, and said they would take a walk by the sea before tea. She looked at the ballroom the way a captain looks at a cloud. So I returned to my ledger and my lilies, to my predictable, vulnerable kingdom, telling myself that privacy was a service and discretion a pillar, while a parallel conviction, like a draft beneath a locked door, whispered that something in my hotel had chosen today to step from rumour into event. The afternoon set itself like silverware on linen each hour laid where it ought to be, and I prepared the ballroom for the charitable conference with the devotion I reserve for practical miracles. An event that passes without comment is a triumph no one applauds. I checked the dais, the rows of chairs, the pitchers of water sweating politely in their trays. I had the sign placed outside in a reassuring font, the sort that promises responsible minutes and unexciting sandwiches. The title of the organization, benevolent to the point of boredom, met the eyes of passing guests and soothed them into not asking questions. Behind the scenes, I fortified the perimeter as a gardener convinces hedges to behave. The corridor lights were new and bright. The service door to the rear stairwell was bolted. The windows along the ballroom's seaside wall were latched so securely that even a rumour could not slip through. Privacy is a product, and today I meant to deliver it. At 10 minutes to the hour, the leader appeared to inspect my preparations. She carried herself as if chairs rose when she entered. Her gaze swept the moulding, the vents high near the ceiling, the keyhole like a small eye at the lock. She wore a dress that announced authority rather than adornment, and her shoes, square at the front, clicked with the logic of a metronome. She asked if the transoms were fixed shut. They were. She asked whether the side passage could be kept free of staff. It could. She asked if anyone, especially any child, might think to hide behind the stage curtains. I said our staff would make certain that no one child or adult would be where they should not be. She nodded once, a stamp without ink, and said the meeting would commence promptly. I walked the perimeter one last time. In the neighbouring music room, the pianist practiced a scale that sounded like a staircase. In the lounge, the boy studied a chess problem with an intensity that suggested pieces moving even when no hand touched them. His grandmother applied herself to a quiet page and an even quieter thought. I informed the porter to keep the corridor clear and to admit no one without the pinned ribbon we had issued for the gathering. He saluted as if this were a maritime operation. In hotels, small rituals feel like flotillas when anxiety rises. And then, because fate enjoys comedy, I noticed the slightest tremor in the curtain at the rear of the ballroom, no more than fabric settling, but enough to tilt the balance of an attentive mind. I sent the assistant manager to lift the hem and look. He found nothing but dust and a forgotten stepladder. He reported with confidence. I accepted his confidence because accepting it kept the hour tidy. We locked the ballroom doors. I pocketed the key. Order, I told myself, is not merely achieved, it is carried. The charitable ladies arrived as a tide of perfume, gloves, and purposeful chatter. They moved past the sign with the ease of people who manufactured it. Each one wore the same determined expression, the same careful shoes with their blunt fronts, the same hats that sat slightly too low, as if hiding from the weather of their own making. They filled the corridor with a rustling confidence and then funneled through the doorway into privacy. I counted them. Counting is how a manager converts doubt to numbers. When their leader crossed the threshold, she paused and looked at me with an unreadable courtesy that felt like a seal applied to an envelope. I returned the look with bland professionalism and turned the key. Outside, the hotel resumed its polite noises. Teacups chimed like small bells. A trolley glided, the polished silver breathing out its small, bright reflections. The sea threw a handful of glitter against the windows and withdrew it again. This is the part of the work that people mistake for idleness. They see a man standing by a door and imagine he is doing nothing. In truth, he is listening to a building the way a doctor listens to a chest. He is collecting fragments, footsteps, hushes, the faint collective intake of breath that accompanies surprise until a pattern declares itself. From within the ballroom there came a ripple of voices settling, then a single voice addressing the room in tones of command. I could not make out the words, only the quality precise, unhurried, final. Later, a hush, as if a curtain inside had lifted to reveal something that did not match the brochure. The hush lengthened. Then a flutter. The nervous laughter of people who have been asked to be braver than they expected. I shifted my weight and did not shift my expression. A bellboy approached with a question about the timing of tea service, and I answered him by memory, my eyes still loosely fixed on the seam where door met frame. Not all watchfulness looks like staring. Not all duty looks like movement. He mentioned timidly that one of the ladies had asked earlier whether our baths ever ran with water that smelled faintly of almonds. He assumed it was a matter of preference. I assured him that our water smelled only of water, and that he should keep the corridor clear, and his mind free of curiosities that did not belong to him. Curiosity is a guest with bad luggage, if you do not ask its purpose. A few minutes later, the chef sent for me. He was displeased, which is a state in which he resembles a kettle just before it sings. A visitor from the conference, gloves on, in a kitchen of flame, had requested to observe the soup base for the evening. He had refused naturally. Kitchens are temples with practical gods. You do not bring strangers to the altar. He asked whether the ladies were chemists. I said they were patrons of a certain cause. He asked whether causes required such attention to saucepans. I said causes require many kinds of attention. He snorted and returned to the worship of butter. When I came back to the corridor, the pianist's scale had softened into a melody with longer breaths, and the air near the ballroom door felt warmer, as if too many thoughts had been exhaled there. I touched the brass and found it almost friendly. Somewhere within, a sound that might have been cloth shaken from a head, though that could easily have been my imagination catching at laundry. A manager lives with the risk of interpreting a creak as a confession. We are paid to be right without being seen to guess. As the hour turned, I caught sight of the boy at the far end of the corridor again. He wandered with the exaggerated aimlessness of a person who wants to be where he is not allowed. I signalled the porter, who fell into casual conversation with him about seaside rock and kite string, and guided him toward the lounge. We keep young minds occupied as a way of keeping their feet from doors. The grandmother appeared moments later with a gaze that made instructions unnecessary. She steered the boy toward the veranda. The tide was out. Some problems solve themselves for an hour when the horizon widens. In the second hour, the voice inside lifted again, quicker now, as if describing a timetable. It rose at one point into something like entertainment, the way a schoolroom brightens when a demonstration goes well. Twice I heard a brief eruption of claps that did not sound like applause for a charity's minutes. They sounded like agreement with a plan. I looked up at the high vents and imagined diagrams. It is remarkable how much architecture knows about the people it shelters. Beams remember what they hear. A staff runner brought me a small bottle found in the service corridor. Foreign lettering on the label, a scent sharp and candid at once. We keep lost property as if it were a moral code. I pocketed it, intending to log it later, and felt the cool glass against my palm, like a reminder that the day would not be satisfied with incidentals. Perhaps the most peculiar moment came when a single collective gasp reached the door, sharp and unanimous, the sort of sound that follows a revelation staged for effect. I do not know what caused it. I know only the echo it cast upon the corridor, which was the echo of delight seasoned with a dash of alarm. A child would call that sound a magic trick. An adult calls it presentation. My building called it stress on its hinges. But we still wonder whether our reverence for privacy becomes a cousin to cowardice when certainty knocks. We still wonder whether the polite fiction of not knowing allows harm to dress in respectability and pass our desk with a nodded good afternoon. It is a hotelier's paradox. Discretion keeps a house safe until the day it does not. Let me loosen the air. Not everything behind closed doors is dangerous. People hold remembrance teas for lost relatives and do not wish strangers to witness their soft grief. Amateur poets read to one another and deserve mercy for the courage it takes. A bridge club once met here, whose laughter restored my faith in laughter. A good hotel protects these modest dignities. That is what I told myself as I checked the lily water and signed 2 deliveries with a legible flourish. When the door at last opened, it was not a flood, but a measured stream, the ladies leaving in orderly curves, faces smooth, gloves immaculate, as if their meeting had ironed them. Their leader paused once more to regard the corridor. The sign? My posture. She thanked me for the excellent arrangements in a voice that made excellence feel like submission. I returned the conventional reply. She requested that her party's tea be served in private. I said, of course, and meant it, though the private felt suddenly like a word with more rooms in it than I had keys for. After they passed, I opened the ballroom to air it, and found only chairs in rows, a dais without paper, water jugs half drunk, and the faintest trace of something sweet in the air that did not belong to tea. On the carpet near the skirting board, a thread of fine hair lay like the tiniest dropped rope. I picked it up, placed it in my pocket ledger, and said, nothing. A man in my position sometimes keeps a museum of small things. They are the footnotes of a building's memory. Evening would bring dinners and music, and the cheerful civilities that persuade a day to end without argument. I told myself that whatever had happened behind the doors belonged to the charter of their meeting and to no other domain. Yet when I passed the lounge, the boy looked up from his chessboard with the expression of someone who has heard a drum very far away and is already marching. His grandmother closed her book and pinned the room with a glance that said she had counted more than chairs today. There would be other preparations, other lists, other keys. The hotel would ask me to be its tranquil face, and I would oblige, because the work is holy in its way. But something had tilted, infinitesimal and irreversible, like a picture frame straightened by a mischievous hand until it looks wrong. The day had found its hinge, and hinges make doors. By the next morning, my hotel felt like a clock that had begun to gain half a second per hour. Nothing was obviously wrong, but the day ran quicker than sense. I began with rules. Rules are a manager's scaffolding. They keep the building upright when other forces tug. I drafted a discreet memorandum for staff and a more public one for guests. The private document reminded my people that animals, however charming, were prohibited in the lounges and dining rooms. The public card took the gentler route. No pets of any kind in public areas. Thank you for preserving our standards. I do not like to sound severe. I prefer to sound inevitable. The boy with the tidy mice complicated inevitability. I had seen the precision of his string and the care of his pockets. A child who minds his creatures so carefully asks leniency without begging it. Still, the rule had to be written where everyone could see it. I positioned the card beside the potted palms, the way one sets a moral near greenery so that it photographs better. The grandmother read it when she passed and glanced up at me, not in protest, but in confirmation, as though I were at last doing the very thing she had counted on me to do. It is a strange feeling to be congratulated for a rule that punishes someone you prefer not to scold. The ballroom party, for their part, required another sheet of paper, a revised timetable for their afternoon session, with stricter instructions about corridor access. Privacy, they wrote, was paramount. They wished to avoid needless disturbance from the young. The word young does heavy lifting in that sentence. I authorized a braided rope at the hallway bend and stationed the porter like a punctuation mark, a full stop where a comma once sufficed. The ladies arrived by twos and threes, gloves immaculate despite the warmth, and I noticed again the fine red lines at the edge of their wigs, a detail that would not resist being noticed. They scratched the way people scratch when they are trying not to be seen scratching. I tell you a small fact from our trade. Once you post a rule about animals, you will immediately be given an animal. A guest will appear with a canary in a travel cage, or a lapdog disguised as a muff, or a terrarium of philosophical lizards. That morning, the incarnation of inevitability was a boy named Bruno Jenkins, who possessed the appetite of a regiment and the entitlement of a minor duke. His parents were generous with opinions and sparing with comprehension. They disliked being refused and disliked even more being contradicted. The boy, cheeks already considering a second chin, wandered the lounge asking whether anyone had seen a special chocolate bar promised to him by a nice lady with a foreign accent. Special, he said, in a tone that made the word sound like a drumbeat in a nursery. His father, Mr. Jenkins, cornered me at the reception and recommended, with broad civic feeling, that the hotel invest in larger traps to deter hypothetical rodents. He had never seen a mouse in our building, but felt prepared to be outraged when he did. He described with relish the sort of contraptions that would make any creature repent its birth. I listened with my service face and made a note to check the basement baits. It is often the loudest voices that ask you to ignore the cause and theatrically pursue the symptom. In the staff room, I opened the lost property drawer and retrieved the small bottle with the foreign label we had found in the service corridor. The scent, when I dared it, was simultaneously sweet and medicinal, like a confection invented by a chemist. A junior maid insisted she had overheard the phrase delayed action from behind the ballroom door the day before. She had the quiver of a person who wants to be useful. I reminded her that our usefulness begins with certainty, and that certainty was not within earshot. She looked chastened, then grateful for being protected from her own imagination. Managing a house is sometimes managing the temperature of rumour. Around noon, a kitchen boy came running to say a lady with an accent like a ruler had attempted to visit the soup again. The chef had spoken softly, but welded the words to the floor. She had left, but not before issuing a smile that did not involve her eyes. In her wake lingered a suggestion of almond. I ordered the kitchen doors kept shut between courses, and ordered the porter to mind who passed with what. It was tedious, the way waltz practice is tedious, and just as necessary for the evening to glide. The grandmother, meanwhile, requested a canary cage from our stores. Not a bird, she clarified, only the cage. She said sometimes a cage is a reminder to breathe differently. I found one, a handsome thing from a prop trunk we keep for theme weekends. Brass wires and a domed top. A small tray for seed that would never be seeded. She placed it near their window and looked at it the way some people look at church. The boy stared at the cage, then at his pockets, performing a silent arithmetic that compared rules to possibilities. My job is to keep the sums correct and the answers kind. I encountered the boy later in the corridor with his string again, the sugar bowls replaced by the more athletic challenge of a door handle and a lampshade. He had managed a line that would have impressed a sailor. He told me with admirable candour that tightropes require both courage and corners. He said that mice, when patient, become as brave as acrobats. I told him with equal candour that managers, when patient, become as suspicious as locksmiths. He laughed, and for one instant the hotel felt simple, a place where everyone wanted the same thing, a decent day. Simplicity ended when the ballroom door so much as sighed. I was not listening at it. It is enough to share a wall with intention, a word carried through the grain of the wood. Formula. Another, transformation. It may have been my imagination giving vowels to vibrations, but imagination is a tool of the vigilant when used as a probe rather than a verdict. I marked the hour in my ledger. One cannot live by hunches, but one can preserve them. A word about cages. The visible ones instruct, the invisible ones govern. Every hotel has both. We cage disorder with rituals, the folded napkin, the polished bell, the tea trolley that arrives at the predictable minute. We cage panic with manners. We cage curiosity with signs that say staff only and guests obey them gratefully. The grandmother's empty cage in their room seemed to me a parable sitting on a windowsill. The boy's mice, invisible today, were the opposite parable moving under a jacket. And in the ballroom, behind a door that pretended to be ordinary, another kind of cage was being prepared. A plan with bars made of rules reversed. I loosen the air because any house needs it. The florist arrived with peonies, too pink for my lobby. I traded them for lilies and sent the peonies to the bistro because bistros forgive extravagance in a way lobbies do not. I tested the pianola. It refused to take a roll, then accepted it with a sigh, the way some people accept compliments. I let the bellboys practice their bow with an umbrella stand as if it were a duchess. These small theatricals keep the spirit from curdling. In the late afternoon, Mr. Jenkins returned with a fresh grievance. His Bruno had vanished at the exact moment tea was due. He suggested the boy had been lured by sweets and demanded that I question the kitchen as if it were a line-up. I began politely, then more firmly, to gather facts. A lift boy had seen Bruno accept a chocolate bar from a tall lady with a curious accent near the stairwell. Another staffer heard a promise of a second bar at a particular hour in the ballroom. I felt the blood move behind my eyes in that steady way that precedes emergency. Promises are often the cages we walk into willingly. I instructed the porter to search the public rooms and the seaside promenade. I took the master key and stood again by the ballroom door. From within came the layered hush of attendees settling after some experiment. A laugh, not kind. The scrape of chairs. My hand went to the keyhole, then to my side. No smoke, no water, no precedent that would justify interruption. The rule that protects privacy and the rule that protects children stared at each other like mirrors. I felt the angle between them sharpening, but we still wonder whether rules, when stacked too neatly, make a ladder for mischief to climb. We still wonder whether a cage built of policy can become, at the wrong moment, a cage for courage. We still wonder whether the duty to reputation can blind a man to the duty that speaks without letterhead. Toward evening, the grandmother found me and asked, in the tone of someone choosing a key, whether I had seen the Jenkins boy since luncheon. I said we were looking. She said the sea smelled anxious. That is not a managerial category, and yet I wrote it down, as I sometimes write the weather because weather has its way with plans. She touched the canary cage with one finger, then looked toward the ballroom with a calm that did not include peace. Dinner would be upon us soon. The band would tune, the glassware would twinkle with committee confidence, and the hotel would attempt, as hotels do, to sing over the drumbeat beneath the floorboards. I revised the seating plan to keep the charitable party to themselves. I asked the chef to keep custody of his sauces like a banker counts keys. I told the staff that order is not a costume, but an oath. And still the corridor outside the ballroom felt like the inside of a held breath. I stood there as the hour tipped. The door remained shut, and my pocket carried a small bottle with a foreign label and a hair-thin thread from a wig. They are nothing, those objects. They are everything when the story snaps them together. I polished the brass knob with my handkerchief and returned to the lobby, where the lilies had opened as if to remind me that some things do as they ought, without supervision. I would supervise anyway. That is what one does when the visible cages gleam and an invisible one begins to rattle. They came down for breakfast in a flotilla of perfume and protocol, the charitable ladies, and the lobby shifted to accommodate them the way water parts for a prow. A manager notices what others excuse. Gloves at every wrist, though the day promised warmth. Hats set low, as if shadow were part of their toilette. The faint, persistent red line where hair meets skin, like an apology from a wig to a forehead. I did not write these things in the guest ledger. I wrote them in the book behind my ribs, where a house stores its private footnotes. One of them asked for matches, though she did not smoke. She struck the flame and held it near the ballroom's transom grill, judging the pull of air as calmly as a surveyor takes a bearing. Another, tall and spare, inquired if the staff entrance to the service corridor could be locked from the outside for morale. I asked, "Whose morale?" She said, "Everyone's," and smiled. The smile did not move any neighbouring muscles. When she turned, the square toes of her shoes pointed like little coffins. Not a curve to them. Shoes designed to deny toes altogether. Fashion will forgive many things. It seldom forgives geometry. They never removed their gloves. Not to butter toast. Not to count coins. Not to touch the polished banister that longs for fingertips. Cloth met everything, as if the world were too unsanitary for the naked palm. I had seen ladies keep gloves on in draughty churches and on unheated trains. I had not seen a choir of them do so in a breakfast room that sweated summer from its panes. The fingers inside the gloves were narrow as instruments. When they lifted cups, the handles looked suddenly frail. At table 5, the boy and his grandmother ate quietly. The boy and his spoon in delicate congress, the grandmother composing her tea with the stepped authority of someone measuring out fate. She did not stare at the ladies. She measured the room as if measuring distance to a shoreline. When one of the ladies passed, the boy's eyes watered. A quick, involuntary reaction like a sneeze arriving without debate. He rubbed his nose and glanced toward the door. The grandmother laid a hand on his sleeve, a gesture that meant both now and not yet. In the lift, I became captive to evidence. 2 of the ladies entered with me on the ground floor and asked for the ballroom. The lift is a confessional for buildings. It gives you closeness you would not otherwise earn. At that range, their wigs were masterpieces of arrangement. But nothing in this world can persuade a scalp to love paste and netting. A rash declares itself honestly. They scratched privately, behind the ear where vanity pretends no one looks. A scent hung about them that was not perfume. Sharp, almond sweet, a note halfway between a sweet shop and a dispensary. One of them tisked at the mirror where we sometimes set a vase. "Mirrors," she said, as if the word were a diagnosis. The lift rose. My heart registered its own ascent. In the pantry I found a spoon oddly stained with the faintest blue, as if a drop of ink had sighed there and died. I do not like mysteries in cutlery. I sent it back to be washed once for hygiene and twice for superstition. The barman, who is harmlessly greedy for odd facts, volunteered that he had seen one of the ladies take a sip of water, and the water, briefly, appeared to hold a ghost of colour. I hushed him, partly because gossip breeds underkindness, partly because words once said become furniture and are hard to move. The leader arrived later to review the afternoon arrangements, a silhouette of competence against the corridor's new bulbs. She stood beneath the vent, inhaled as if tasting a recipe in the air, and declared she would not tolerate draughts. Her gloves flexed without creasing. She asked whether any child might, by mischief or accident, be within scent. The word startled me. People ask whether a child can hear. They do not ask whether a child can be smelt. I told her the rope would remain, the porter would patrol, and the door would serve its appointed purpose, which is to obey its master. She approved with the kind of nod that dismisses as it blesses. Rules invite theatre, a sign that says no admittance. Whispers try me to every blood cell under 15. Twice that morning I escorted boys from the bend in the corridor, once with a gentle hand on the shoulder, once with the more persuasive hand of a grandmother whose walking stick carried the memory of mountains. The charitable ladies watched these small exiles with interest, not the maternal kind, but the keen regard of scientists whose apparatus is nearly ready. A manager stands where interests intersect and pretends they are all compatible. By luncheon, the staff had gathered a glossary of small, stubborn details. The chambermaid swore their pillows shed wiry hairs the way old brushes do. The laundry foreman remarked on stockings that left no impression in the toe. The pianist claimed the leader's eyes had a shine like varnish. I distrust the adjectives of artists when they wander past their instruments, but I trust their attentiveness. They are paid to hear things. The boy reappeared with his string, secret as a breath, and asked if he might, just once, test a small routine in the empty corner of the lounge. The grandmother looked at me and did not interfere. He laid a line between a brass spittoon, which no one uses but everyone respects, and a distant table leg. The mice, those minute acrobats, made their private pilgrimage. Whiskers reading currents as a blind reader interprets pages. I ought to have halted it. I let it run its short course. Somewhere in the middle of their careful progress, one of the ladies crossed the doorway, stopped, and stood with the consideration of a cat watching a chimney. The mice froze. The boy's face tensed. Not fear exactly, but the knowledge that a game had become a problem. The lady's nostrils flared, very slightly. Then she moved on, leaving behind her that almond chemical tail of smell. We all exhaled without making a sound of it. I had to loosen the air after that. I made my rounds with cosmetic intent. I swapped the lilies, whose pollen began to sully the cloth for fresh, less conversational ones. I approved a pianist's plan to include a cheerful foxtrot at tea. The one with the obliging middle eight that makes the timid feel suddenly possible. In the staff corridor, I told a joke about a dowager and a deck chair to the porter. A joke older than my waistcoat, but effective as a charm. In the kitchen, I sampled the custard and pronounced it decent, which is high praise for custard on a day like this. Evidence persisted. A room service tray returned from the charitable party carried cups with faint rings and a scent that did not belong to tea. A napkin bore a powdery smudge, not flour, not sugar, something finer that vanished when disturbed. The chef muttered about saboteurs and saints, mutters being his defense against mutiny. I kept the bottle with the foreign label in my pocket, cool as a token, light as a hypothesis. The label's script meandered like a river that forgot its own banks. I traced it with my thumb. The glass answered with silence. The grandmother asked to speak with me in the writing room. She did not waste syllables. She said that certain women wear wigs to hide what the scalp does not afford, that certain hands wear gloves to hide what the fingers confess, that certain feet prefer shoes with blunt fronts because they quarrel with toes. She said boys who smell healthy can be a torment to the wrong noses. She said this as if summarizing a medical circular. I told her I was a practical man, charged with practical matters. She said practicality is what you need when stories are true. She asked whether I would keep boys from doors. I said I would. She said, then we are allies for the hour. I left that room having gained neither comfort nor deniability. But we still wonder whether the habit of observing without concluding is a virtue or a cowardice, whether a gentleman's discretion is only the polished face of fear. We still wonder whether the human talent for pattern hunting is meant to save us or merely torment us with incomplete mosaics. Let me speak of ordinary consolations. A letter arrived from a couple who had honeymooned here 20 years before, thanking us for the memory of a rainstorm that had driven them into our library, where they discovered each other's taste in novels. The bandleader, who pretends to be frivolous and is in fact a moralist, wrote Love's Old Sweet Song into the dance list in their honor. A child in room 17 laughed at the shadow puppet rabbit his father made against the window shade, and the laughter set the corridor right for an entire minute. The world gives you these small coins when the purse of certainty is empty. In mid-afternoon, as the ladies settled themselves once again inside their sealed ballroom, I stood for a long moment at the door and considered knocking for no reason except the kind that later becomes a reason. I did not. Instead, I checked the rope, the porter, the hinges, the corridor lights, the purity of the glass in the water jugs. I am a caretaker of surfaces that shelter depths. I accept this as calling rather than disguise. I walked away and met the boy. He carried nothing in his hands, and everything in his intention. His expression told me he had found a new corner of the map. I told him corners are where dust and danger agree to meet. He said maps are lies until somebody walks them. We regarded one another, not adversaries now, but reluctant partners in the unwritten chapter. I sent him to the veranda. He went, but the story, like a smell that clings to cloth, went with him. Evening would bring the next test. The charitable ladies had requested a tasting of soups before the dinner service, a request that on paper was no more ominous than asking to sample jam. The chef locked his larder with the ceremony of a priest. I pocketed my keys, and the bottle no one had claimed, and the thread of hair no one had mourned, and I rehearsed my posture for the kind of calm that does not crack when a room full of gloves decides that gloves are no longer required. The ballroom door had a way of looking innocent after you locked it, like a child with crumbs on his collar. Before the afternoon session, I performed the usual pilgrimage. Dais dusted, water refilled, vents tested, chairs aligned in rows that pleased the eye and invited obedience. I circled once more with a cold spirit level I keep for occasions when straightness must argue for sanity. The porter asked whether the key would remain in my pocket at all times. I touched it as a priest touches a reliquary. Nothing breeds confidence like a visible ritual. The leader arrived early to approve the air. She lifted a match to the transom grill and watched the flame steady. No draught. She examined the skirting board as if letters might crawl there. Her gloves were new or newly scrubbed. They had that faintly powdery sheen of fabric that has learned its owner's hands by heart. She asked me again whether any child might be able to hear through the vents. The word hear sat between us like a formal document. I promised silence. She gazed at the room not as a venue, but as an apparatus, and then permitted herself the smallest smile, the kind people practice in mirrors to make sure it never bends into humanity. When she was satisfied, she allowed the ladies to enter. They filed in with the solemnity of a guild. Almost at once, I caught a thin breath of that almond chemical smell, as if the air itself had unwrapped a sweet. A junior maid, hurrying past with linens, faltered and gripped the trolley. She is not fainting stock. A year in a summer hotel cures theatrics. Yet she blinked as if her eyes had been told an unpleasant truth. I sent her for water and told her to sort napkins in the back, the way you send a restless mind into the arithmetic of folds. From within, the single voice began, the one I had come to recognize by cadence, if not by name. It spoke with the measured certainty of commandments. Silence followed, a stage-set kind of silence. Then a rustle cloth, hair, and the sharp intake that comes when a curtain withdraws to reveal an unadvertised exhibit. I will not claim more. I am not an eavesdropper by profession, only a custodian of thresholds. Whatever demonstrations occurred, the building kept their details the way walls keep winters cold reluctantly, and only as an aftertaste. My barman arrived with a discovery cupped in his palm, the tiniest smear of vivid blue on a linen napkin delivered from the ballroom earlier. Not ink, he said, not jam. When disturbed, it parted like smoke. I told him to wash his hands and forget the colour existed. He nodded, and then, as if agreeing with himself, admitted he had heard a phrase when he set down Jug's delayed action. I said words can disguise themselves as echoes. He looked relieved to be granted an ordinary explanation, and went off to polish glass until it squeaked its approval. An hour sharpened into a point. The voice within brightened, the way a lecturer brightens when reaching the signature idea. It was followed by a choral approval, gloved hands clapping softly, and then a ripple of laughter of the sort you hear in rooms where plans are declared workable. In the corridor a scent passed, sweet and medicinal together, as if a boiled sweet had studied chemistry. I stood very still. The porter, stationed where the rope made its polite barrier, looked at me for instruction and found none on my face. There is a kind of calm that is really a room taking notes. A small incident attempted to grow into a crisis. The ventilation over the side passage coughed dust onto the carpet runner. I fetched the maintenance man, who climbed a step-ladder and lifted the grill. In the moment the metal came free, a sound from within the ballroom rose up the shaft words I could not catch, a syllable that could have been formula. We secured the grill quietly, wiped the evidence from the runner, and behaved like men repairing furniture, which is to say, we held our breath until we could let it out without adding meaning to it. News from the front of ordinary life arrived to keep us from believing in nothing but extraordinary things. The florist's boy delivered a second crate of lilies with a note that read, "We overcounted yesterday. The bandleader asked if he might switch the second foxtrot for a gentle tango, because the couples this week had knees that would not be hurried." In the bistro, a child spilled strawberry ice and apologized with such formality that the waitress gave him a new bowl as if knighthood had been involved. These are the little stitches that keep a day from bursting its seams. When the ballroom door finally opened, it did so not as a mouth, but as a letterbox. A sliver first, then an envelope of figures passing through. Several ladies carried their hats as if relieved to be back under their disguises. One paused near the mirror and adjusted the line of her wig with a practised touch that made my throat tighten because practice implies frequency. I caught sight just once of a hand without its glove. The fingers were long, the nails narrow and oddly blunt, and for a breath the skin looked too smooth, as if it had chosen not to remember creases. Then the glove returned, and with it the illusion of customary anatomy. After they had streamed to tea in their private room, the leader returned to me with a request that sounded like an accounting entry. They would require a tasting of the evening's soup, but not in the kitchen, a private sampling in their quarters. I explained that health codes and kitchen pride conspire against such privileges. She suggested I arrange a compromise, small portions sent on a tray, covered, strictly punctual. I agreed, because that is what a manager does when rules and necessity ask him to be agile without admitting it. I opened the ballroom to the ordinary air. The rows were as neat as I had left them, but the room carried a faint residue of sweetness, as if polite confectioners had argued with logic. Near the dais we found a pin plane, practical, the sort used to anchor false hair to ambition. On the carpet near the front row, a single wiry thread lay like a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence. I bagged both items for my private museum of explanations. Not yet. Even our vacuum hesitated, as though unsure whether to swallow evidence or leave it to the man with the keys. Bruno Jenkins' father burst into the lobby then, vibration preceding volume, demanding the return of his boy and the head of the person who had mislaid him. He cited negligence, conspiracy, possibly sedition. I soothed with the repertoire of phrases that turn raw grievance into digestible grievance. The mother, in a voice that could curdle cream, insisted that Bruno had been promised chocolate by a lady who seemed very sure of everything, and that surely the hotel kept records of such promises. I assured her that hotels keep records of rooms, not temptations. She ordered a search of kitchens and cupboards. I ordered precisely that, partly because it might help, partly to postpone the moment when the mirror of my own doubt would stare back and accuse me of preferring policy to alarm. The grandmother approached with her walking stick and the sort of hush that makes a corridor listen. She asked whether anything peculiar had happened inside the ballroom. I said the meeting had been entirely uneventful. She said uneventful is a word buildings use when they feel responsible. She placed on the table a small brass canary cage we had lent her and asked whether I had ever known a cage to keep a storm out. I told her a cage can at least remind the person holding it to breathe. She nodded, and in her nod I heard the sea. Evening advanced, as it always does, carrying with it cutlery's clear chiming, a page of the dinner list, and the dream of an uneventful service. I could almost believe in the dream when the chef appeared, immaculate and implacable, announcing that the tasting portions had been dispatched, covered like secrets, to the private room of the charitable ladies. He had cooked the soup himself and sent it under guard. He could not explain why the kitchen still smelled faintly of almonds. But we still wonder whether the line between discretion and complicity is chalk or stone, whether a well-run house can be too well run to let truth knock loudly enough, whether order itself can be the tightest glove a conscience ever wore. Here is a softer turn of breath. The band tried their gentle tango, and the couples managed it bravely, in shoes that had forgotten some of their youth. An elderly guest asked if she might keep a lily to press in a book, and I surrendered one as if it had always been hers. The porter, proud of his rope and his vigilance, told me unprompted that he had kept all children away from the ballroom doors that afternoon. He paused, proud and a little boyish. I put a hand on his shoulder. The truth is that he had done exactly what I asked. The other truth is that I was no longer sure it was what the day required. I took inventory of my pockets. The key warm from use, a label in a language that looped like a river, the plain pin, the hair-thin thread, the smell lodged in memory that does not belong to soup. The Excelsior asked me, as always, to be its tranquil face. I lifted my chin and obliged. Somewhere between the dining room and the ballroom, the day had chosen its hinge. I felt the building readying itself to swing. Tea is when a hotel pretends the world has no emergencies. We lay out the small armistice skinner that sings at the rim. Sandwiches that require only the kind of decisions which never ruin a life. Scones with clotted cream to slow a pulse toward gratitude. I arranged the lounge as one arranges a polite afternoon. Sunlight managed by curtains, a hum of talk below the pitch of rumour. The band leader's gentlest foxtrot held in reserve. The charitable ladies had asked for privacy with their tray. Other guests drifted toward the tea tables as sparrows drift to a safe hedge. Calm is choreography. I have practiced its steps for years. The Jenkins family descended precisely at 4, late enough to be noticed, early enough to blame someone else for the delay. Mr. Jenkins announced to the room, as if the room were a magistrate, that his Bruno had vanished after luncheon, but would no doubt materialize at the scent of cake. Mrs. Jenkins declared she would take the sponge, the seed cake, and the moral high ground. Their confidence would have convinced even a missing boy that returning was beneath him. I placed them near the window, partly for the view, partly because light makes grievance look less theatrical. At the far end of the lounge, the boy with the thoughtful eyes sat with his grandmother. He held his cup with both hands, the way the young steady themselves when the weather inside them rises. She considered the room the way a surgeon considers a symptom. Between us, a waiter ushered in an extra trolley, the one I keep for days, that might need an apology. I felt ready to offer a dozen apologies, and had not yet chosen a sin. The charitable ladies did not take tea in the lounge, but several passed through to reach their private room, moving as a current moves, inevitable and strangely chill. Gloves, always. Wigs that sat like verdicts upon the head. A faint red line at the hairline. A scratch delivered by vanity's tools. That almond chemical scent again, joined now by something faintly sweet, as if a boiled sweet had dissolved into air and chosen to stay. One paused at the threshold and lifted her chin to test a draught that was not there. Another peered with investigative calm beneath a chair, as if inventorying shadows. Their leader, the tall one whose posture edited the corridor, did not speak. But the room understood she had issued an instruction. Chairs never learn a human language, yet they obey tone. Mine edged a millimetre into place of their own accord. We had not yet reached the first comfortable silences when a disturbance, fine as thread and just as insistent, pulled tight across the sills of the moment. The pianist faltered. The knife at the carving station clicked once against its plate. The boy's head lifted, listening to something no one had named. On the skirting board, under the palms, A small, quick shadow travelled with a purpose that will be recognized by anyone who has looked for the difference between a scurry and a run. A mouse is not a catastrophe. Reputations fear them because reputations are fragile and mice are diligent. Still, I have seen grown men stand on chairs for less. There was a beat, the drawn breath that precedes either farce or alarm, and then the room performed both. A lady shrieked with theatrical vigour. A gentleman rose with military usefulness, and then looked around for an enemy worth saluting. Mr. Jenkins leapt up in triumph, happy to be right about something at last, and demanded to know what sort of traps we kept, and whether a bounty could be posted. I signalled the porter and the page boy with two small movements that would, in another context, have begun a waltz. A hotel lives on such hand language. What undid me was not the shriek or the chair standings. It was the look on the faces of the charitable ladies who happened to be present. No fear, not even disgust. They observed as a connoisseur observes a painting he has commissioned, with the tranquil authority of expectation fulfilled. One of them tilted her head the way a hawk considers a field. The leader's nostrils widened by a width that would not show in a photograph. The boy's grandmother set down her cup without a clink and reached almost absently for her walking stick. She did not move it. She only made sure it would move when needed. The mouse, for its part, paused near an abandoned napkin and washed its whiskers with the decorum of a creature that believes it belongs to a better drawing-room than most. In the instant of its stillness, I saw what I had not allowed myself to see, the neatness of its coat, the soft circumference of its attention, the absence of the furtive. It looked not like a thief, but like a boy who had mislaid his scale. I cannot claim knowledge beyond this impression. I can only report that the grandmother's face carried both recognition and sorrow, the way a photograph sometimes holds the moment after a name is said aloud. I told myself what managers tell themselves, that the lounge would forgive a small chase if the end were swift and the dignity preserved. I sent the porter left and the page boy right. A careful narrowing. The mouse darted under the console where we keep the unreadable magazines, and then across the foot of the tall palms toward the corridor that bends, politely, toward the private tea-room of the charitable ladies. There, at the braided rope, the porter bent, ready to snatch. He is kind and quick. The small creature slipped between the tassels as easily as a thought. A single glove twitched, and the mouse stopped, as if a hand could write a command in the air that even small animals obey. I will not pretend bravery. My heart's dutiful instrument that it is beat with the conviction that reputation would run on small found toward the very room where my vigilance had tied the knot of privacy tightest. The leader stepped aside, the way a door steps aside, and looked down with the quiet approval of a plan recognizing its own handwriting. Then the mouse was gone to mine to a zone I myself had fortified, obeying a rule I had posted, supervised by a discretion I had cultivated, all of it suddenly wrong, like a well-laid table when someone switches the salt and sugar. We resumed the semblance of order. Chairs surrendered their high ground and returned to the floor. I made soothing noises to Mr. Jenkins, who desired vengeance in triplicate, and the immediate invention of a mousetrap that would double as a public performance. Mrs. Jenkins held court on the subject of health violations while eating a second sandwich, which is, in English law, an absolution. I apologized to the room with my posture, my tray, and my presence, until the temperature of embarrassment cooled. This is an art. It has no medals. In the corner, the boy sat very still. His grandmother looked at me, not with accusation, not with forgiveness, but with the briefest transfer of weight, the way two people carry a heavy thing together for one step. She asked if the private tea for the charity women had been served promptly. I said it had. She asked if our chef had already sent soup to the same party earlier in the afternoon for a tasting. I said he had small portions, covered, guarded by pride. She said the sea would be different by nightfall, and sometimes the only hope is to catch a tide. Changing. I did not understand, and I understood. I allowed the room a breath, and then went to the service passage where the private tea had gone. On a butler's tray near the half-open door stood cups, with an echo of scent inside them. The same almond sweetness, courteous and clinical. The same vanishing blue smear that appears when a drop pretending to be clear confesses itself to cloth. The bottle in my pocket, foreign letters looping like a river with secrets, grew heavier. Earlier that day I had sounded out 2 words on its label that even my schoolboy French could not excuse: formula and delayed. I had dismissed the rest as chemistry's gossip. I began to hear a different grammar. The kitchen sent up another tiered stand to the lounge. I intercepted it, checked the cloches, sent it onward. My chef, immaculate in his whites, swore upon his mother and sauce velouté that nothing he made contained almonds, cyanide, or superstition. I believed him for the simple reason that a man who kneels to butter tells fewer lies than most. He asked whether the women would join dinner. I said they would. He said he would keep guard over the soup himself, and that the stockpot would not know a stranger's shadow. He meant it as a promise. Promises today were cages with hopeful bars. Let me loosen the air before it tightens to wire. A child in room 12 lost his first tooth, and showed it to the maid, as if showing proof that life had begun in earnest. She wrote a note from a benevolent fairy full of spelling errors on purpose, and left a coin beneath the glass. 2 honeymooners asked whether the band might play their song, and then could not remember which song had been theirs. They danced anyway, cheerful impostors at their own memory. The barman discovered he could balance a spoon on his nose for exactly 11 seconds, and won a bet that cost no one anything worth keeping. These are the levities a building creates when its bones begin to worry. The Jenkinses returned, then withdrew, then returned again, as if grief had become a corridor they could not stop pacing. The father asked whether I would close the hotel and search every room. The mother asked whether I could guarantee the safety of children in an establishment that allowed performing vermin. I held fast to language that keeps lawsuits asleep and sympathy awake. In the middle of my reassurance, a young waiter reported that one of the charity ladies had made an inquiry in the kitchen about the precise hour the soup for the children's high tea would be ladled tomorrow. He found it an odd question. I found it a new weight in my pocket, where the bottle already lay. But we still wonder whether we love rules, because they let us avoid naming the thing we know. Whether a gentleman's poise is a mask we borrow from fear. Whether the formality of a locked door can become a blessing we give to harm. we still wonder whether the smallest creature in a room can carry the largest truth, and whether those of us who keep houses may need to break the very habits that make them safe in order to keep them safe at all. Night stirred itself like a cat. Lamps found their amber. The band tested a tune that walked rather than ran. I ordered the porter to keep a kinder eye. Not wider kindness sees differently. I set the tea-room to rights and stood in the doorway of the private salon where the charitable ladies had taken their cakes, trying to taste, in the ghost of that almond sweetness, the shape of what would come. Tomorrow's soup would be ready at noon. The tide was, indeed, changing. I could feel the building lean to hear it. Complaints are a hotel's weather. They blow in from all directions, test the windows, and leave a smell on the upholstery. The charitable ladies, having finished their private tea, sent me a breeze of them cool, precise, and oddly synchronized. One found the ballroom lamps too eager. Another judged the corridor morally draughty. A third deplored the piano's temperament as if the instrument had a character flaw. Their leader asked if the rugs could be steadied, a request so abstract it could only mean power. I answered as one answers light rain. Promptly, and with faith that the sun will reassert itself, their gloves never came off, not to gesture, not to sign a chit, not to accept a menu that would have liked to warm itself against a human palm. They scratched very slightly as they spoke, as if each sentence cost a whisper of irritation. I recorded their wishes in my small, faithful book, and noticed that their shoes left no squeak upon the polished floors. Quiet feet on a loud day. The grandmother, passing at that moment with the boy, measured them with a sailor's eye for tides. The boy watched their gloved hands the way children watch puppets when they have guessed there are strings and do not yet know whose fingers pull them. I took the leader through the dinner arrangements. The tasting portions had pleased her. She approved the hour, the seating apart, the guarantee that the kitchen would attend to their soup first. She asked with special care that the tureens be covered until the last possible moment. Heat, she added, is dignity. I thought then, not for the first time, of the small bottle with the foreign label resting in my pocket, the one that smelled lightly of sweetness and instruction. The chef had assured me nothing he cooked contained almonds, poisons, or metaphors, but scents wander through buildings like rumours. They slip under doors and learn new meanings. Meanwhile, ordinary life refused to admit itself defeated. A postcard came for a widow who returns every year on the week her marriage began. She pressed it to her chest before she read it, as if the paper could hum a memory. The bellboy discovered a lost umbrella carved with a staghorn handle and returned it to a gentleman whose gratitude grew until he tipped in notes rather than coins. The pianist promised me his tango would not break a single heart, only soften two. These are the reasons a man like me loves a house. It gives you ballast. From the Jenkinses I received weather of a rougher kind. They had not found their boy. Mr. Jenkins wished me to understand that any establishment permitting a rodent to interrupt tea could not possibly be trusted with the custodianship of a child, and that he would be speaking to the local authorities, the national press, and perhaps, if time allowed, Parliament. Mrs. Jenkins demanded restorative cake and the right to speak sharply to anyone she pleased. I gave her the cake. Sharpness we manage by refusing to echo it. At the edge of this domestic storm, The boy with the mice returned to me with a question he treated like a small flame. Had I ever noticed, he asked, how cats can tell the difference between a game and a hunt. I answered that houses can tell the same difference, and that today mine had begun to look for cover. He looked toward the corridor that led to the ballroom and then back at me, as if deciding whether I understood a message only half delivered. His grandmother laid a steadying hand upon his shoulder. She had the look of someone counting minutes against a tide chart. Before the dinner hour, we made our last adjustments. I checked every hinge. I polished the brass a final time. I walked the perimeter as a captain walks a deck before night watch. The charitable ladies drifted toward the dining room in files of 2, never bumping, never pausing, as if someone had measured their spacing with a ruler. Their leader paused at the threshold and inhaled. No scent of draught, only the clink of readiness. She nodded to me with a gratitude that felt like being appointed custodian of a secret I had not agreed to keep. The first course went out soup, simple and reputable. Our routine is a waltz with covered tureens, a bow, a ladle that writes ovals in the air, steam that behaves like applause. I posted myself near the passage that serves both the charitable party and the main dining room, a place where one can keep 2 promises in view. The chef, solemn as a judge, stood at the kitchen hatch with his arms folded across his apron, watching the tureens depart in the proper order. He is a man who trusts principles, sanitation, heat, the refusal to improvise with stock. Then the farce began, wearing the coat of panic. A shriek cut the air from the main dining room high, not musical, and a chair scraped the floor as if trying to climb a wall. 1 shout creates 2. 2 become 4. Soon the room is a choir. Mice, someone said, with such conviction that the word itself seemed to come skittering under the tablecloths. The first lady, to see the small shapes upon the carpet, lifted her skirt in a curtsy not taught in any dancing school. A gentleman leapt to defend a stranger's ankle with a butter knife, a weapon against neither war nor whiskers. Glass chimed. A spoon went to ground. My heart executed the neat trick it knows too well, lifting without leaving my ribs. I strode in with the porter left and the page boy right, our practiced maneuver for minor catastrophe. The mice there were many ran with purpose rather than panic, a detail that chilled me because panic is honest and purpose is editorial. They did not scatter, they chose lines. They paused near chair legs as if reconnoitering, and then made for the skirting boards, forming a small, relentless parade toward the service passage that also served the charitable party. The almond chemical scent rose like a memory. The grandmother stood at the dining room's edge, watching with an expression that married pity to clarity. The boy's hands clenched on his chair like a sailor gripping a rail. He did not cry out. A particular mouse-neat, bright-eyed, utterly unashamed paused at the foot of the Jenkinses' table. The parents shrieked as if grief and vermin occupied the same word. The mouse gazed upward with a composure I have seldom seen in either children or guests. The father kicked not at the creature exactly, but at the day that had disobeyed him, and the mouse slipped just beyond the arc of injury. For the smallest second I thought I recognized not a face, but a manner. The appetite that had strutted through my lobby in short trousers. Recognition, however, is not a fact. I tightened my jaw around what might have been a name. We cleared the main room the way one clears a stage after a dropped curtain. Rapidly, with civilized lies. "Nothing to distress you, madam, only a trifling inconvenience, sir. Please allow us to refresh your table away from the excitement." The staff moved with the choreography of necessity. Meanwhile, a minor exodus of mice, too many to be accounted for by error, flowed into the service passage with the confidence of guests who had seen the seating plan in advance. There was, beneath the clamour, a feedback of laughter from the private room, the laughter of people who find a demonstration successful. I intercepted a footman carrying a fresh tureen toward that room and lifted the lid. Steam rose, honest as bread. The chef's soup looked innocent. Soups always do. On the rim of the ladle, though, a blue ghost clung as if hesitant to admit it existed. I wiped it with a napkin. The blue vanished like a rumour under sunlight. The footman, startled by my pause, looked as if he had stumbled into diplomacy without training. I sent him on his way and kept the napkin. It smelled faintly of instructions. Mr. Jenkins demanded action in a volume that can curdle butter. He called for traps, poisons, brooms, magistrates, a sermon. I gave him brooms and the promise of traps. I did not give him the truth, because I did not yet know how to name it without breaking the frame that held my world together. The grandmother passed me and murmured very softly that certain soups make certain plans easier, and that some parades begin in kitchens. The boy looked at me the way one looks through a window at an approaching storm, as if asking whether the glass would hold. But we still wonder whether the discipline of privacy can become a costume for calamity, whether a manager's oath to preserve order must be broken in order to keep faith, whether a house's reputation is worth anything if it can only survive by not seeing what walks through its rooms. We still wonder whether the smallest creature carrying a human fate deserves a different kind of rule. I let the air loosen. The band, brave souls, shifted to a tune with long phrases that invite the shaken to breathe. A waiter slipped a brandy to a gentleman who had discovered the limits of gallantry and needed to sit. In a quiet corner, a child who had not seen any of it read a picture book to a doll with the patience of a monk. The lilies held their composure. The building, though, had changed key. It vibrated at a frequency you feel under the fingernails. Night settled with a firmness that felt like intention. The charitable ladies dined with the serenity of people whose plans had tested well. Their leader left a note for me commendations for our efficient management in unusual circumstances. I folded the note into my ledger. Efficient is one word for what we had been. Another is blind. I counted my keys and found none missing. Then I counted my certainties and found the arithmetic less cooperative. When I finally stood alone in the service corridor, the blue smudged napkin in my hand and that foreign-labelled bottle warm in my pocket, I realized that the threshold between discretion and duty lay exactly where my shoes were standing. I could not move without choosing. The door at my back led to a dining room learning a new definition of decorum. The door ahead led to a party of women who wore gloves as if skin itself were treachery. And somewhere between doors ran small lives with an urgent assignment. I straightened my tie. The house waited to see which door its manager would open. Between two doors, a conscience chooses its trade. I stood in the service passage with a smudged napkin that smelled faintly of instructions and a pocket that carried a small foreign bottle like a permission I had not requested. Behind me, the dining room stitched itself back together with cutlery and apology. Ahead of me, the private salon of the charitable ladies held the quiet of a demonstration that had run to its last slide. A manager, properly reared, does not intrude. A caretaker, honestly alarmed, sometimes must. I lifted a tray, arranged 2 respectable teapots upon it as alibi, and knocked. The leader opened the door the width of courtesy. Behind her I saw a scatter of hats resting upon chairbacks, like patient birds, the disciplined curve of untouched sandwiches, and on a side table wigs arranged with the care one gives relics. The air was heavy with that almond chemical sweetness. Her gloves had returned to their post. Her smile had not. "We are quite satisfied," she said. The words were polite. The tone was a dismissal written in ink. I set the tray upon a trolley and let the door close. In the moment before latch met keeper, a sound slid into the corridor, teeny claws against wood. Not panicked. Purposeful. Then silence. Trained and absolute. I found the grandmother in the writing room, the brass canary cage beside her chair. The boy was not in sight. She lifted her eyes and, without preface, said a sentence that altered the furniture of my mind. "There are women in this world," she said, "who are not women at all. They are witches, and the highest of them is here." Her voice did not invite disbelief or faith. It proposed a fact, the way the sea proposes a horizon. I set the tray down. She reached into her handbag and placed on the table a twin to the bottle in my pocket. Only hers wore its full name in looping script. Formula 86 Delayed Action Mousemaker. The words arranged themselves with the inevitability of a verdict. "I found this label yesterday," she added, "in a room the leader uses. Your staff call her the president of a charity. She is the Grand High Witch. Their plan is simple as a clock. Lace sweets in shops across the land with this potion. The children who eat them turn into mice after a delay, and the world pretends it was an accident of chemistry. Today they dined apart. That was their mistake. I am not a man who surrenders immediately to any narrative but the one written in my ledger. Yet my ledger had filled these last days with too many footnotes. Gloves that never came off, wigs that sighed against skin, shoes whose toes made geometry a doctrine, a boy named Bruno who had been promised a chocolate bar by a tall lady with a foreign accent, and had then vanished like a breath, the blue ghost on silver, the almond note in the air, the tidy parade of mice that chose lines instead of panic. A manager collects patterns with the same care he collects keys. Sometimes both ask to open the same door. "Where is the boy?" I asked. She tilted the cage so the light found its empty wires. "Here," she said softly, and touched the cage knot to indicate a prisoner but a companion. Then, with the calm of a nurse explaining medicine, she told me the boy had crept behind the ballroom curtains earlier that day. The witches had stripped off wigs and gloves and revealed hands that did not belong in any glove. A demonstration had occurred. A chocolate had been produced. The timetable of the potion had been described in brisk, delighted tones. Bruno had been fetched at the very second required, and, before an approving room, had become a mouse. The boy I had watched with string and patience my boy had later met the same fate because he had listened too well at the keyhole of evil. She said the names with clarity. Grand High Witch, Formula 86, Delayed Action Mouse Maker. She did not dramatize a syllable. I felt the floor steady and then tilt, the way a ship readjusts when it understands the sea it is in. And at dinner? I asked. At dinner, she said, we return the favor. She described with an efficiency a general might envy how she and the mouse boy had slipped into a certain room, secured a bottle of the formula, and later involved my kitchen without my kitchen's knowledge. We laced their soup, she said. We were careful with dose and patient with time. You saw what ran under your tables. Those were not vermin. Those were plans losing their human masks. A building grows quiet when truth enters it. Even the curtains felt attentive. I thought of the laughter from the private room, the serenity with which the charitable ladies had taken their tea, the measured way the mice had streamed toward the service passage, the blue stain upon a ladle that had nothing to do with my chef's vocabularies. My duty forked cleanly, like a path around a tree that has fallen in a storm. On one side, the rule that protects a house. Mice must be removed with speed and without sentiment. On the other, a rule older than hospitality. The innocent may not be swept away with the guilty simply because they share a shape. I asked the grandmother what she required of me. She said, courage lent without spectacle. She asked that I keep the staff from turning the dining room into a public war, that I permit her to collect 2 small lives, one who listens too well, and one who eats too much and is loved anyway before housekeeping fulfills the oldest policy a hotel knows when mice are present. And, she added, you must be ready for the Jenkinses. They will demand the impossible and blame you for failing to invent it. We rehearsed in 3 sentences a practical salvation. I sent the porter to fetch humane traps from the cellar, the dusty old things from a quaint era when the bistro had tried to be philosophical about pests. He returned with 2, surprised to be part of a kindness he hadn't been told to name. I instructed him quietly to bring any captured mouse to the writing room first. I told the kitchen to keep all doors shut until I gave the word, then walked the dining room, speaking with a calm so practiced it finally became true. A brief disturbance now resolved, I told the tables. Our apologies travel with your dessert. In the middle of this, the Jenkinses arrived with a fresh weather front. Mr. Jenkins wanted to sue a universe that permitted tax-paying families to be inconvenienced by reality. Mrs. Jenkins required witnesses to agree that the hotel had either invented their son's disappearance or clumsily failed to prevent it. In a pause that might have admitted reason, a small mouse appeared upon the fringe of the carpet and sat up with a composure that belonged to a boy who had been promised chocolate his whole life. Mrs. Jenkins screamed. Mr. Jenkins lunged. The mouse dodged with the resigned grace of a child, avoiding a hug he does not want. I stepped between boot and fate. Let me, I said to the room in a voice I save for midnight fires and broken water mains. Let me. The porter arrived with the little cage, the mechanism of mercy. The mouse entered almost willingly, as if recognizing the shape of help, and for an instant I allowed myself the heresy of naming him without proof. Bruno, I said in my head, as one says a prayer that leaves no mark on the air. We carried the cage as if it contained a lesson. I delivered it to the grandmother. She accepted it without triumph and set it beside the empty canary cage, making a pair of parentheses in which the world could catch its breath. The second mouse took longer. He was quick without panic, precise without bravado, a creature who had taught himself to balance on string and on the edge of adult sentences. He waited near the leg of a chair in the writing room until the corridor had spent its drama, and then came, as if responding to a summons no ear could hear. He looked up at the grandmother, and then at me with the earnest gravity I had seen over chessmen. If I tell you that a mouse can bow, you are free to distrust me. Yet that is what I saw, a small inclination of head that felt like acceptance. He entered the second trap. We closed it gently. The grandmother's eyes moistened in a way that did not campaign for attention. Duty's other half still waited. A house must be restored to the version of the world it promises at the front door. We did what hotels do when mice are where they must not be. We set aside spectacle. We acted with speed. We offered no commentary to guests. What became of the numerous small shapes that had dined where they should not have, I will not embroider. We were efficient, discreet, and obeyed the law of every kitchen and pantry in Britain since flour was flour. I removed from my staff any appetite for cruelty with a look and a word. A house can be firm without rehearsing brutality. But we still wonder whether mercy granted at the scale of inches means anything in a world measured by rooms, whether saving 2 small lives absolves a manager who presided over a day of preventable harm, whether rules that keep a building upright can be loosened just enough to let in truth without letting in chaos. We still wonder whether a man whose profession is surfaces can learn in time to read depths and act for them. Let me ease the air we have tightened. In the lounge, a gentleman proposed to his sweetheart over a slice of Battenberg, and she accepted with a nod that made the band's pianist play the softest major chord I have ever heard. A little girl in room 6 lost a shoe behind the radiator and decided after a search party of 3 that the radiator could keep it as a souvenir. The chef sent out a lemon posset, so perfect that a table of widows fell briefly silent, as if good pudding were proof that the world can. On alternate Tuesdays, remember how to be kind. I returned to the writing room. The grandmother had placed a hand over each small cage. The boy mouse's whiskers trembled with attention. The other mouse, Bruno, by every law of posture and appetite, sniffed at a crumb with hope already mending itself into habit. I set my ledger on the table and, for the first time that day, wrote not an incident, but a sentence. Tonight we chose what a house is for. It is not only shelter for guests, it is shelter too for truth, when truth is small. Outside, the sea exhaled. The corridor bulbs hummed themselves into their evening patience. I checked my pockets, the key warm, the blue smudged napkin folded away. The bottle with its scandalously frank label surrendered to the top drawer of my desk. The hotel, imperfect and persevering, carried on. So did I. With my tie straight and my duty widened by 2 inches, I had not known it could stretch. A hotel survives a crisis by persuading the next hour to behave. After the 2 small cages had been claimed by mercy rather than policy, I set the dining room to rights with the haste of a man restoring a stage between acts. Tablecloths smoothed, glassware reset, the pianist bribed with gratitude to play something that sounded like composure. Outside the private salon, the charitable ladies dined with the satisfied quiet of shareholders after a vote. If there was triumph in that silence, it did not rattle the plates. But buildings learn a new pitch after truth is spoken in them, and my corridors now hummed in a key I could not name. The first signal that the hour would not remain persuaded came as a giggle, where no giggle belonged, high and delighted from behind the private room door. I have learned to sort laughter the way a sommelier sorts fruit. This was the laughter of method finding its mark. A second sound followed, not laughter at all, rather a collective intake, the small gasp a room makes when it sees its own future. Then a chair scraped, then two, then many, and I glimpsed, through the crack of a door opened by a waitress carrying a tray, a scatter of hats and a shiver of wigs. Hands flew to hairlines, gloves flew to touch faces. Faces changed. I cannot tell you I saw the miracle directly. The door fell shut like a conscience. But I smelled the change. Almond sweet, then a faint sharpness, as if sugar had remembered it was chemistry. I heard the skitter of small claws across wood. Dozens, then more. The orchestra of a plan re-entering the world in its true shape. The waitress backed away with her tray held like a shield, and crossed herself with the handle of a teapot. I set the tray down on a side table and entered with the authority a manager borrows. When a house asks him to be its spine, what I found had the logic of a fable and the mess of a kitchen. Along the skirting board, in a line too tidy to be accident, ran mice with an agitation that felt almost articulate. On chairs and against the legs of tables, the charitable ladies now unhooded of their borrowed hair, their gloves fallen to the floor like discarded manners, scrabbled and stamped and called for explanations that the English language did not yet provide. I saw the leader rise, her mouth shaping a syllable I recognized from the label in my pocket, and then, with a shiver that gathered her from inside out, the powerful became small. There is a particular stillness when an instrument breaks in a musician's hands. It is made of shock and the quick count of what remains. That stillness filled the room. Staff do not need orders for certain labours. Tradition moves them like tide. Brooms appeared, doors opened to the service passage. The porter's face arranged itself into the resignation of men who will spend the night forgetting what they know about mercy, because policy does not know it. I told them with one look to be swift but not savage. The law of hotels does not ask for hatred. It asks for flaws without apology. Mice poured like beads from a broken string. The brooms made their dull music. The door to the corridor gulped and closed. The room breathed. On the carpet lay a single pair of square-toed shoes, empty, and beside them a hat with a label I did not need to read. I picked up the hat and felt in its weight the remainder of an authority that had depended on height. Beside the hat lay a handbag whose clasp was less proud than it had been at luncheon. The grandmother entered as if arriving for a doctor's appointment she had expected for years. She looked once to the skirts of the tables, once to the skirting board, then to me. "It is done," she said. Not triumph. Confirmation. aftershocks, punctuate such an hour like commas. Mr. Jenkins, hearing that mice had been routed from a private room, demanded to see the body of whoever was responsible, a request biology could not satisfy. Mrs. Jenkins required both justice and pudding. I granted her one. The boy mouse in his cage, Bruno by posture, by appetite, by the hopeful tilt of his head, sniffed at a crumb the grandmother had placed for him, and looked as pleased as boys look when cakes arrive without effort. The other mouse sat with the concentration I had seen over chessboards, whiskers forward, ready for the next idea. "He listens," the grandmother murmured. "He always did." I sent the staff to their stations, posted the porter at the main corridor, and stood alone by the private room door with the key warm in my hand. The room within smelled like almonds, then less so, then like a room again. Chairs righted themselves under coaxing. Wigs were collected with tongs and resigned to a bin lined with the kind of linen we use for failures. On the table nearest the head of the room lay a notebook bound in something that had once fancied itself leather, its pages fat with names. I did not touch it. Some objects in a crime belong to the next chapter, but I noted it the way I note leaks, by the damage they will do if ignored. The grandmother requested a quiet parley in the writing room. She set the two small cages on the table, regarded them as one regards twin lamps lit against sudden dark, and proposed a plan with an economy that honoured time. The Grand High Witch kept her lair upstairs, she said. She will have left instruments behind her. With your key and my common sense, we may fetch what could be used to mend what cannot be mended. She asked for no heroics. She asked for the small favour a house can grant at midnight, a corridor free of witnesses, and a door persuaded to change its mind. Before that errand, I made the evening breathe. I ordered the band to play a foxtrot with long phrases. I told the barman to polish his glasses loudly and tell a joke about a duchess and a dachshund. I sent scones to the loudest corners of the dining room. A widower asked for the lemon posset again, and then, embarrassed by his appetite for comfort, told a story about cricket that had no point, and therefore did its work. These are poultices a house applies to the places where panic left finger marks. We took the service stair. The grandmother climbed with the patience of mountain people, pausing when the building paused, as old structures do. On the landing outside the leader's suite, I listened for voices, for the disloyal click of a camera, for fate. Only the radiator spoke, whispering the travelogue of old water. I turned the key and let the door admit us, the way a gentleman admits trouble, quietly, as if it were paying. The suite was the sort of order one achieves with money rather than attention. Bags stood open on stands, lined in silk the colour of proclamations. A dressing table displayed bottles and jars, arranged with militarized prettiness. The wig stand now bare looked in decent, undecorated anatomy. I opened one valise. Inside lay packets of banknotes banded like small bricks, and beside them a ledger with columns that held addresses and sums and dates, and a neat sign at the top of several pages, England. The grandmother turned the pages the way a nurse turns a body to spare a wound. "Here," she said, tapping a page with a list of sweet shops that would have joined tomorrow's programme. "There is work to be done after today." On the dressing table, beneath a silk scarf that had mislaid its vanity, we found bottles like the one in my desk drawer, their labels unabashed in their intent. Formula 86 Delayed Action Mousemaker. Several were half empty. One wore a crust at the lip where chemical meets air and becomes a rumour. I have handled wine with more reverence than I handled those bottles. The grandmother took one, wrapped it in a towel with the brisk tenderness of someone swaddling a stubborn truth, and placed it in her bag. A map, she said, of the ledger, and a purse to pay for the journey. A photograph on the mantel caught my caution. The leader in a crowd of women, all wearing the same gloves and the same confidence, the same square-toed geometry that had mocked my flaws. I turned it face down. The grandmother approved without words. We closed the valise with its money, then changed our minds and opened it again. It is a curious duty, dividing spoils from tools. In the end, we took only what would be weapon and witness. The ledger, a fist of notes for travel and traps, and the bottle, whose name would not permit euphemism. In the corridor, the porter met us with his imperfect poker face. "All's quiet, sir," he said, which in a hotel means the noise has retreated into rooms. He glanced at the towel-swaddled shape in the grandmother's bag and decided it was exactly what the world needed it to be. The boy mouse and Bruno waited in the writing room, their cages set like parentheses around a plan. The grandmother looked older and younger at once, as people do when purpose has either stolen or returned time. But we still wonder whether a manager's job is to escort consequences to the front door or to escort courage through back stairwells, whether discretion is the last defense of evil or the first courtesy of the good, whether a house fulfills its oath by shining or by sheltering what must be done in the dark. Let me loosen the air before it holds its breath again. The band struck up a nightingale, sang in Berkeley Square, and for a moment the whole hotel moved as one body in a slow circle that forgave knees and memories. A child, unaware of revolutions, fell asleep over a book and woke with the print on his cheek like a temporary tattoo of grammar. The florist's second delivery, refused earlier for being too pink, became suddenly perfect in the bistro, where a newly engaged couple decided pink was a language they spoke. We sat manager and grandmother, cages between us, and laid the next hour like cutlery. She would write to certain addresses before dawn. I would record nothing and remember everything. The ledger would travel. The bottle would not stay long in one place. The money would become tickets, traps, telegrams. In the morning, I would draft a statement about an unusual infestation and the decisive measures taken. Language that keeps scandal in its crate. Tonight, I poured tea for us both, because tea survives most truths. Down the corridor, the sea rehearsed its usual argument with the shore, and as usual, won by repetition. I looked at the two small cages, and at the woman whose eyes had been counting tides her whole life. I thought of a boy who loved string and corners, and of another boy who loved chocolate, and the anonymity of being loved despite it. My hotel is a place where people come to sleep in the belief that the world is briefly reasonable. Perhaps, I thought, it could also be a place where the unreasonable is met with a reason that has nerves in it. Night work in a hotel is not the opposite of day work. It is day work spoken in a lower voice. After the private room had emptied of certainty and filled with aftermath, I gathered my staff in the service hall, where announcements sound like blessings if you say them steadily. "We will proceed," I said, as if order were contagious. I assigned the brooms to the men who wield them gently, the polishing cloths to the women who understand that shine can be a sedative, the door duty to the porter who treats ropes like covenants. We would clean what could be cleaned, comfort what could be comforted, and postpone explanations until explanations could behave. I visited the kitchen first. The chef, sleeves immaculate, had put away his temper as if it were a knife that did not belong on the table. He asked no questions whose answers would require new categories. I told him only what he needed. The charitable party would not require supper. The main dining room must be restored to a version of the world that forgives, and all food leaving his hatch should wear its lids like helmets. He nodded, then tasted a sauce as if proving to himself that ordinary genius still exists. He said the almond he kept imagining was not in his pantry. I told him the imagination was sometimes where facts go first to be recognized. The porter returned from the corridor with a report that sounded more like a weather bulletin than news. The hotel had calmed to a breeze. The Jenkinses, however, had not. Their grief ran in short, demanding gusts. I sent hot chocolate to their room because grief and sugar are old colleagues. I wrote a note that promised a search throughout the night and meant it. In our trade, hope is as practical as keys. In the writing room, the grandmother sat with the 2 small cages and a notebook open before her. She had begun to copy names from the ledger we had taken upstairs, a list of sweet shops and dates and sums that made sentences when read aloud. Manchester. Next week, 40 jars, Whitby. Tuesday, 12 boxes. The names marched without shame. This, she said, tapping the bottle swaddled in towel, was meant for a country. She wrote a second list in a firmer hand, a set of towns and contacts, people whose addresses were not printed but remembered. "These are those who still listen," she said. "Pharmacists, a school nurse, a minister with fewer illusions than sermons." We decided on our division of labours. She would write through until dawn. I would prepare the hotel to wake to a story that could be survived. The mice, Bruno, by cheerfulness, the boy, by intent, listened from their wire verandas. Bruno nibbled with a happiness that belongs to creatures certain of being fed. The boy sat very still, whiskers forward, learning the muscle of patience in a new body. It is a curious miracle to watch attention wear fur. There are details from the day I would rather store in the cool cupboard where troublesome things go to sleep. Yet the ledger of truth asks for entries. I dispatched discreet men to convey the wigs and square-toed shoes to the back bin, without parading them like trophies. I set the band to a night schedule of generous tempos. I allowed the barman one more story than usual because the right story changes the air the way jasmine changes a path. At my desk, I opened the small drawer where managers keep the objects that argue with their own existence, lost cufflinks that claim impossible owners, unaddressed letters found under chairs, and now a blue-smudged napkin, folded like a secret. I added to it the hat we recovered from the private room, its label curiously blank, where pride should have printed a name. When I returned to the writing room, the grandmother had finished her letters. We sealed them into envelopes addressed with the elegance that older hands give to ink. We planned the route for morning telegrams, knowing that wires travel faster than apologies. I offered to assign a footman as a runner. She shook her head. "We must use daylight honestly," she said. "The fewer uniforms involved, the fewer uniforms offended." She asked for a small valise. I provided one from lost property, a leather case whose owner had never returned. It seemed right that it should leave carrying something a nation needed. The corridor at midnight carries confidences. A maid confessed in a whisper that she had glimpsed the leader ungloved earlier. A hand too smooth, nails too narrow to be mistakes. A glimpse that made the maid feel both foolish and correct. A bellboy admitted he had hidden near a landing one afternoon and heard a voice call "children stink," a sentence so ugly it rang true. I told them both they had done right to tell me and wrong to stare. We make better witnesses when we do not add embroidery. There remained the question no rule-book keeps a page for: what to say to parents whose child now wore whiskers. The book knows instructions for fires, floods, fevers, the day a duke drops a ring into custard. It does not know this. The grandmother relieved me. "I will visit them," she said. "Parents do not hear managers at such times. They hear a voice that has held a feverish hand." She lifted Bruno's cage, and for a moment his small nose pressed to the wire like a boy to a sweet shop window. I carried the other cage. We went together. The Jenkins suite held the stale weather of blame. Mr. Jenkins began with accusations that tangled themselves like fishing line. Mrs. Jenkins reached for rhetoric and found tears. The grandmother set Bruno's cage on the writing desk and spoke names. Bruno, a woman who promised chocolate. A potion with a number that sounded like a train. A meeting behind closed doors. The way delayed action means grief does not arrive on schedule, but it arrives all the same. She did not ask for belief. She waited while disbelief tried to spend itself, and then set about the only work belief ever does, making plans. She promised care. She promised to search for a way back, even while choosing to love what is. There was, for one unguarded second, a softness in Mrs. Jenkins that made the room feel almost forgiven. Then pride rearranged itself, and the softness became scolding again. That is how some hearts survive. Back downstairs, the boy mouse watched us with that steady look that suggests a human sentence trying to form behind new teeth. "Tomorrow," the grandmother told him, "we begin again." I asked what beginning meant. "Letters and travel," she said. "Addresses and doors. Also, breakfast." It is a solid theology, beginning with breakfast. I drafted a statement for the morning. An unusual infestation addressed promptly by staff. Certain private functions curtailed. The management thanks guests for their patience. Assurances that sanitary standards were and remain unimpeachable. The truth would walk under those words the way a river walks under a bridge. Not a lian instrument. A house cannot publish every page of its diary. The policeman who finally arrived near 2 a.m. wore the kind of patience that grows in seaside towns. He made notes with a dignity that did not mock us. He accepted my description of an unfortunate outbreak and my account of decisive measures. He inspected the traps, the kitchen, the corridors, the rope. He declined to inspect the private room more than once. He told me mice love conventions because conventions forget crumbs. He did not know how right he was. He left with a promise to speak to the council about baiting the promenade. There are problems so large that they must be disguised as small ones in order to be handled. Let me loosen the air. The pianist, on his way out, played the softest 4 bars of a lullaby to an empty room, and then looked embarrassed to have been overheard. A chambermaid found a tiny toy soldier in a pocket of a borrowed dinner jacket and lined it up with 3 others on the laundry shelf as if an army might be recruited from lost property. The night clerk boiled an egg at 3, the way night clerks do in every century, and the sound of his spoon against shell made the building feel domesticated again. But we still wonder whether efficiency is merely decency done too fast to ask questions, whether a manager's discretion can become the blindfold evil prefers, whether mercy for 2 small lives can teach a house to enlarge its own definition of order before the next test arrives, wearing gloves and a charitable name. When fatigue at last sat on my shoulder like a polite bird, I locked the drawer that held the bottle and the ledger's copy. I walked the silent perimeter lounge, corridor, ballroom with its straightened chairs that knew what they had witnessed without being built to tell it. In the writing room I paused. The grandmother slept in her chair as old mountain women sleep, upright, prepared to wake into purpose. The boy mouse dozed with his nose to the bars, as if sniffing a stair he would climb in his next dream. The sea leaned its shoulder against the town and breathed. I wrote 1 more line in my private book, the one no auditor will ask to see. A house is a promise. Tonight we kept it twice, once to guests who want to sleep, and once to a truth that wants to live. Then I closed the book, and with the key warm in my palm, turned out the light. Dawn in a seaside hotel is a janitor of light. It lifts last night from the carpets, opens the curtains to let the sea resume its murmuring jurisdiction, and invites respectable noises back into hallways that have stored secrets. I rose from the chair in my office with the stiffness one earns by being necessary after midnight, and walked the first circuit. Lobby, lounge, corridor, kitchen hatch. The building answered in its morning voice, hums and taps, the click of crockery, the sigh of the boiler. The trolleys aligning their wheels with today. In the writing room, the grandmother was already awake, as if sleep had been a courtesy extended to the chair rather than to her. The 2 small cages sat on the table like punctuation around a plan. Bruno snuffled in a way that assured me breakfast would mend almost anything short of apocalypse. The other mouse my careful boys stood on his hind legs, whiskers forward. The way he does when listening makes a shape of itself. She had a sheaf of envelopes tied with string and a valise packed with the ledger copy, a towel-swaddled bottle, and money from a suitcase that will not be missed by anyone we shall miss. We divided the morning. She would send telegrams from the post office as soon as it opened. A scatter of warning shots aimed at sweet shops on the ledger list, at a chemist in Whitby, a pharmacist cousin in York, a school nurse friend in Manchester. Certain stock must be returned, she had drafted soberly, for fear of taint. No drama, only the language officials respect at breakfast. I would attend to the hotel's official face, a notice to guests of an overnight infestation efficiently managed, a reassuring round with the council inspector, the meticulous theatre that turns a crisis into housekeeping. First, breakfast. A hotel's character lives in its trays before 9 o'clock. I arranged for a dish of raisins and sliced apple for our 2 smallest charges, added a thimble lid of warm milk that would scandalize no rulebook, and smuggled it under a napkin to the writing room. Bruno accepted his portion with the gravity of a duke receiving his investiture. The boy nibbled with the focused courtesy of someone who prefers to think while he eats. The grandmother watched them with a nurse's fondness, then with a general's briskness. "Today we travel," she told them softly. "But first, papers and officials." The policeman returned at 8 with a colleague who smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and bylaws. He inspected the traps empty now and pronounced himself satisfied. "Convention in town, was there?" he asked, breezily suspicious. "Conventions draw crumbs." I agreed that crumbs had been the problem. He warned me against sensational stories, then told one of his own about a regiment of rats that had once held a pier under siege. Men comfort themselves by inventing anecdotes that are kinder than the truth at hand. I provided tea and the confidence that accompanies forms signed in triplicate. The council inspector arrived with a clipboard so organized it resembled a creed. He approved the kitchen, took a sanitary sniff at the drains, and circled the ballroom with a frown that meant diligence rather than doom. "You've had activity," he said, as if the word itself might leave footprints. I presented my statement, an unusual incursion, addressed promptly, private functions curtailed, all surfaces sanctified twice. He ticked boxes while I recited the litany's health demands. He left behind a copy of his endorsement, a talisman hotels wave when rumour trims its nails and tries to scratch. The staff relaxed by a half-inch. The lilies, unchanged, pretended to have done all the work. I found the grandmother afterward in the portico, the valise at her feet, a list of addresses on her lap. She had written to a churchwarden in one town and a librarian in another, because, she said, responsibility hides in places where people keep quiet things. There will be travel, she told me. There will be doors that open, because ink arrives before footsteps. She asked if I could spare a page boy to run the envelopes to the Morning Post. I spared my most reliable boy and pressed his cap, as if earnestness could be ironed in. The Jenkinses wished to see me. They were composed and more dangerous for it. Mr. Jenkins had discovered a new tone-statistical indignation and asked for numbers. How many mice? How many minutes? How many measures? Mrs. Jenkins wore that tight expression some used to keep tears from rearranging authority. I offered a credit of 3 nights, a private breakfast, and the attentions of our best porter, which is what a manager offers when he cannot offer the impossible. "And our son," Mr. Jenkins said, carefully. The word son sat on the carpet between us like a dropped cufflink no one knew how to pick up. I told them their boy was being tended with care, that a specialist had been consulted, that no door in this building would be allowed to close on him. All true, if told sideways. They accepted the breakfast and declined the comfort. Some mornings cannot be invited to behave. In the kitchen, my chef, a man who makes conciliation taste like lemon, produced soft-boiled eggs that wore their shells like respectable hats, toast triangles obedient to geometry, and a kettle that did not require persuasion. "No almonds," he said, with the earnestness of Achilles swearing off his heel. I asked him to prepare a small parcel for the road: cheese, bread, a slice of cake for the grandmother, and a handful of raisins for 2 travellers whose tickets would not be taken at the window, but at the pocket. He packed with the gravity of a pharmacist composing a remedy. We convened once more in the writing room. The grandmother reviewed the ledger. The names marched across its pages like a map refusing to be decorative. "Here and here," she said, tapping Bristol and Dundee and all the small streets between, where a sweet jar is a landmark. She slid the towel-swaddled bottle deeper into the valise. "A tool and a testimony," she said. "One for use, one for proof." She wrote our parting compact on a scrap. I would say nothing and remember everything. She would say enough and forget nothing. It is a decent division, she decided. Between us, we are approximately 1 honest man. A detail from yesterday returned with the insisting tread of a debt collector. The notebook I had seen in the private room, thick with names. I fetched it from the locked drawer. Together we turned pages. On one were columns of sums, on another lists of addresses. On a third, a neat section headed Hotels. I searched for hours and did not find it. I felt both relieved and accused. The grandmother tore out 2 pages, England, sweet shops, and folded them along an old woman's line of power. "Keep the rest," she said. "Sometimes danger dies of loneliness when you starve it of context." Before she left, she took the boy's cage in both hands and spoke to him in a voice that respects fur without forgetting the boy within. She promised him a plan larger than grief. Letters posted, trains caught, doors opened, a long campaign conducted with the unsexy virtues persistence, daylight, and clean pockets. "We will write to Norway, too," she added, a glint of homeland in her vowels, "because seas are not walls to those who address envelopes." The mouse boy lifted his face to the bars, as if to memorize her breath. Bruno, munching, consented to any plan that travelled with cake. I walked them to the side door that respectable adventures prefer. The porter, complicit in decency, produced a cab at the exact second a story requires a cab. I handed the grandmother a small envelope with the hotel's stamped paper inside letters of introduction to 2 city managers who would open their offices and their ears. "Managers are a breed," I said. "We know the currency of favour and the speed of rumours." She accepted with a nod that set the tide line in her gaze. "Your house has done more than polish," she said. I found I had nothing adequate in reply, so I bowed for the house. As the cab pulled away, the town resumed its pretending. Sun on windows, gulls with their municipal complaints, a newspaper vendor insisting history had happened again. I returned to the lobby and turned the notice from last night face down, a small inversion that felt like a benediction. At reception, a gentleman requested a walking map. A lady asked whether the ballroom could be viewed for a possible charity concert. I said yes to both with a voice that had learned to carry 2 promises at once. But we still wonder whether a house keeps faith by keeping quiet or by keeping records. Whether silence is a hospitality extended to truth or to the men who profit from its absence, whether the oaths of our trade, privacy, discretion, calm, must be amended when evil chooses our stationery to write its invitations. We still wonder whether mercy toward 2 small lives obliges us to practice a louder kind of order in the world outside the lobby. Let me loosen the air that has been wound like string. The pianist discovered the morning light makes a certain note sound friendlier, and exploited it till the room smiled. A small boy traded his toy soldier to the bellboy for a brass luggage tag, and then traded back, each convinced he had won. The lilies carried on being lilies, which is not nothing in a century determined to hurry. By noon the inspector's certificate hung behind the desk like a charm that has agreed to be a document. The dining room filled with the peaceful weapons of civilization, knives that butter, forks that moderate appetites, spoons that ladle warmth. I returned to my office, unlocked the drawer, and looked once more at the bottle whose name refuses euphemism. I wrote a line in the book I keep for myself. Our house is more than beds and brass. Today it was a hinge. Then I closed the book, straightened the pens, and went to meet the next guest, whose only emergency was that his suitcase believed itself heavier than it was. There are tempests that arrive in top hats, and Mr. Jenkins wore his like a weather vane. By early afternoon he had transformed grief into a sequence of legal nouns. He requested the manager, the proprietor, the board of directors, the council inspector a second time, the police again, our insurance particulars, and a statement for the record that would later be broken into the kindling of letters to newspapers. Mrs. Jenkins, cooled to a brittle clarity, demanded the names of every staff member who had colluded with vermin. I offered them the only furniture a house like mine can provide at such an hour: chairs that do not wobble, tea that arrives before sentences shatter, and a voice that bends without breaking. They wanted their Bruno returned full stop. The grandmother, back from the post with her telegrams loosed into the country like bright birds, arrived with the small cage whose occupant lifted his whiskered face exactly as boys lift faces when cake is promised. She addressed the parents with the patience of somebody who has waited for dawns that take their time. "He is your son," she said. "He eats, he laughs, he blinks in the same rhythm. He knows your names. A change of size is not a change of soul. This is a truth easily stated and rarely accepted by people who measure love in inches and reputation in photographs." Mr. Jenkins demanded to know who had done this. There was a justice available to us, and we had served it last night, and it looked like mice slipping along skirting boards toward a back door. The larger justice, the one with a long jaw and a longer memory, had boarded a cab with a ledger and a bottle wrapped in a towel. I told him what I could without lying, and without assigning a villain to a shape he could kick. He told me he would instruct solicitors. I told him he already had, in effect, by choosing his tone. After a long, stony silence, Mrs. Jenkins addressed the cage as one admonishes a boy who has ruined a suit. "Bruno," she said, "stop nibbling when adults are speaking." The mouse stopped, as Bruno always had stopped when a superior tone entered a room. Then he began again, because hunger is older than etiquette. If I tell you that I saw the smallest falter in her mouth, a place where tenderness might have slipped in, you may think I am romanticizing, perhaps. Or perhaps a manager grows adept at hearing the hinges of faces. The practicalities gathered like receipts. Our insurer required a report. I wrote one in 2 columns. Facts measurable with brooms and timetables, and incidents whose language the policy could survive. The police returned, as seaside police do, with a clipboard and a rueful competence. They noted that no child had been abducted, that a mouse had been found, that the hotel had responded decisively. They declined to theorize. Policemen do not like conspiracies that refuse to sign the register. The councilman telephoned to confirm his earlier satisfaction and to advise me to have a quiet word with the pest control firm. I thanked him as if he had named a saint. A journalist drifted through the lobby like a cloud that had lost its weather. He had a notebook, a smile trained for doors, and a question about unusual goings-on at the Excelsior. I gave him our statement, the one with the soft verbs and polished nouns. He asked whether children were safe to dine here. I said they were safer here than where sweets arrive with unfamiliar labels. It was a risky sentence, like setting down a glass on a table you hope is there. He blinked, then wrote something long and unhelpful and left, which is to say, he did his job, and so did I. The grandmother asked for a small private conference in the writing room. The two cages stood between us like twin lamps. "If they will not receive him," she said, glancing toward the Jenkinses' suite, "we must decide whether the boy sleeps tonight in a place where he is respected." She spoke without drama. Respect in her hands was a piece of cutlery. Polished, functional, not optional. I said the house could provide a spare birdcage of dignified size and a quiet corner if needed. Also a saucer lid for water because dignity is thirsty. We arranged such things without naming the sorrow beneath them. Names can overfeed grief. A detail from the original tangle kept tugging at my sleeve. The Grand High Witch's ledger upstairs with its neat columns, and a page titled England, where sweet shops were listed the way generals list bridges. We had already taken pages for Bristol, Dundee, Manchester, Whitby. I made a copy of the Bournemouth entries, and, in a private courage I barely recognized as mine, wrote the names of two local confectioners I had seen in that book onto a separate sheet with a manager's hand. The grandmother nodded, tucked the list with her others, and said almost cheerfully, "We will pay them a visit after luncheon. Buttons can be unsewn from coats, one town at a time. A hotel keeps a separate arithmetic of decency." I credited the Jenkins account for their remaining nights and struck from their bill every item that could be described as consolation. I authorized a car at their disposal and the porter to carry bruised pride as if it were luggage. I told the staff, plainly, that the boy in the cage would not be mocked or gaped at, and that any laughter in his presence must be cheerful and addressed to him, not about him. There are houses where such instructions would sound sentimental. In this house, this day, they were policy. We were interrupted by a delegation of the charitable ladies' remnants, those who had not, the night before, scuttled out under the broom of justice. They wanted a refund, naturally, and an apology for interference with a private function. Their leader was gone. In her place were lieutenants whose confidence had the wobble of wigs in a crosswind. I processed their requests with the firmness one reserves for customers whose complaint reveals them more than it reveals your service. "We can offer you," I said, "exactly what we offered. A room, a broom, and a bill." They took the refund and left silently, which is to say they had discovered the limits of their magic in a house that had learned to clean with its eyes open. Let me ease the air. A couple from Leeds celebrated a ruby anniversary with trifles and a badly tuned chorus of "We'll meet again," which is a promise people make to time more than to each other. A small boy asked the bellboy whether mice could be taught to salute. The bellboy saluted first to show it could be done. The pianist found a jaunty march and played it so softly at tea that complaints forgot their subject long enough to become stories about trains. In the late afternoon, the Jenkinses announced their decision. They would leave Bournemouth immediately to consult specialists of national repute. The father's suitcase clicked shut like a verdict. The mother's hat sat on her head with the authority of an alibi. They declined the porter's offer to carry the small cage. For a moment that lasted longer than it should, no one held it. Then the grandmother stepped forward and took charge of Bruno with the tact of someone rescuing a photograph from rain. "I will keep him safe until you send word," she said. "He will not be lonely." Mr. Jenkins attempted protest, but protest is a poor tugboat. Once a decision has already left harbour. They departed with the formal chill of people whose story will grow sharper in the telling. In the quiet they left, the boy mouse looked at us both and did an unmistakably human thing. He sighed. I have heard that sound from guests whose trains are late, and from children who understand the hour too well. The grandmother stroked the air near his whiskers and said, "We will not waste this day." It was then she told me, with a simple candour that felt like a key, that in the book she had read to her grandson long ago, there was a line about how witches wear wigs, that itch, and shoes that hide toes. It belonged to another room, another country, and yet here it had guided her hand like a compass. A small detail from a story had met a small detail from a lobby, and together they had pointed true north. But we still wonder whether the law's slow cart will ever find the right road when the signposts are written in chemistry and wigs, whether a manager's ledger can forgive itself for using gentle lies to protect brave truths, whether the parents of the world will ever learn that love is not a contract with height and skin, but a treaty with recognition. We still wonder whether houses like mine, built for sleep, must sometimes wake fully and admit that reputation without courage is only brass without polish. Practical matters persisted as they must. I sent a second round of telegrams at her direction. I wrote to head office, an honest letter that did not invite panic, but did not court complacency. I locked the remaining bottles and the notebook in a drawer where the keys are not kept, and then hid the keys where drawers do not look. I walked the afternoon perimeter and discovered, to my relief, that lilies can still be lilies on the day after miracles and messes. The sea, uncontracted by any of us, continued to practice being a law. Toward evening, a letter arrived on Excelsior stationery I had never ordered. It was from the leader, dated yesterday morning before the hour turned. "We commend your efficiency," it read, "and trust your discretion." I folded it once and once again until it became the size of a pill that no one would ever swallow. Efficiency is easy. Discretion is easy. The trick, I realized as the lamps came on, is choosing what not to be discreet about, and doing it before the tide changes. A house keeps two diaries. One is the ledger auditors admire, the other lives in a manager's pocket where no accountant may balance it. After the Jenkinses' departure and the last telegram dispatched, I opened my private book, the one that has no columns, only sentences, and wrote a heading I had never used. Notes on a day the building learned a new word. Beneath it I listed what would sound like folklore to a sensible man. Wigs that confessed by itching, shoes that denied toes, a bottle that told the time of a metamorphosis, a ballroom that learned to hold its breath. Then I wrote the sensible part anyway. How many brooms, how many trays, how many apologies it took to domesticate chaos before supper. The grandmother returned from the post with a smell of outside air and victory upon her coat. She set the small valise on the writing table, the ledger copy within now bristling with penciled marks like a map annotated by a stern angel. She removed the towel-wrapped bottle and looked at it as one looks at a snake one has agreed to carry until the proper ditch is found. She lit a small cigar, the way she always does when thought must be given a shape and a pace, and the ribbon of smoke curled with the confidence of the North Sea in a favourable wind. We inventoried what we had taken from the Grand High Witch's room money, enough to make warnings mobile, a ledger crisp with malice, the bottle whose label refused euphemism. We placed beside them the artifacts my hotel had surrendered in the night. The hat with no name, the plain pin for false hair, a blue smudged napkin, and my statement on Excelsior paper that smoothed the day into nouns health inspectors can pronounce. 2 kinds of truth, she said, arranging the exhibits in twin rows. 1 for rooms, 1 for roads. I made a last circuit of the ballroom. After the storm, it had the tidy sadness of a schoolroom between bell and lesson. Chairs aligned themselves into obedient rows, as if they had not watched authority become small and fast. Under the dais I found 1 more stiff hair like a drawn hyphen, another punctuation to add to my pocket museum. On the head table the water jugs had the ghost of almond still about their throats, a scent that reminded me how evil loves the manners of good glassware. I opened the tall windows to admit the salts of the channel and let the room remember that events are only guests. Back at reception, I turned the page in the register with ceremonial care. Yesterday's names remain themselves. People keep writing their lives in a neat hand, even when the day refuses to imitate it. I added a private mark beside the charitable partia dot in my own code and closed the book. The night clerk would copy reservations in a fairer script, the way he does, and the day would accept them as prophecy. We must never allow prophecy to believe it is the only author. It is a manager's odd privilege to know a building's pulse. Mine had steadied, though a new rhythm ran beneath it like a second metronome. The porter, proud of having been the rope that kept curiosity in its lane, practiced his bow to the empty lobby, until the bow could stand unaided. The pianist balanced a saucer on the edge of the instrument and played a single line from "We'll gather lilacs so tenderly that even the lilies on the console seem to lean toward it." In the bistro, the barman discovered that a teaspoon will stand upright in a glass of water for 8 heartbeats if your hand has learned patience from a crisis. Lightness is a duty on a day like this. The bellboy cut a tiny passport from a menu card and, with sham ceremony, stamped it with the Excelsior crest for Bruno, who accepted the document through the bars with the dignity of a traveller accustomed to control. The chef produced a sugar cube and grated it gently into a saucer lid, so that both small guests could pretend to scrabble for treasure and win. A chambermaid fashioned a curtain tie into a hammock and looked pleased with the notion of comfort scaled to whiskers. None of this restored a boy to boyhood. All of it taught the building how to hold what could not yet be mended. I spent 1 hour with the grandmother over maps. She had drawn a skein of lines from Bournemouth north and east, linking the Ledger's sweet shops to people who would answer her letters. She planned to knock in daylight, to speak in the grammar of invoices and deliveries, to trade the bottle's name for action, without theatre. "We will not tell stories to children," she said. "We will speak to the men who fill jars." She looked up and added almost slyly, "and to their wives, who know where the real inventory is kept." She had a list of hotel managers, 2 names I had given her from an old Union circularman, and women who understand that discretion is elastic when a house is threatened. "We shall borrow their offices and their telephones," she said, "and their kettles." I wrote my own letters, carefully addressed and careful in tone, to 2 seaside properties whose managers I have known through seasons of plumbing and Parliament. I did not use the word witch. Instead, I wrote of a consignment of imported sweets that may have been adulterated and of a group using charitable titles to purchase privacy for disreputable experiments. I offered nothing that could be mocked and everything that could be acted upon. A manager's influence is not glamour. It is a shelf where one more letter may be stacked without causing collapse. A policeman returned with tidings that the local paper had elected to run a small item about a temporary infestation and the brisk response of the staff. He looked faintly disappointed that we could not give him villainy with a face he could interrogate. "If I hear of any mischief with sweet jars," he said, tapping his notebook, "I shall be sure to recall our conversation." "Do," I told him, and imagine the day when that line would be looked back upon as a hinge. In the late afternoon, the sea grew grey in a way that makes promises to fishermen. The grandmother wished for a final quiet look at the ballroom, not as a battlefield, but as a room reclaimed. We stood together under the high ceiling. She ran a hand along the back of a chair, as if greeting an old friend after a misunderstanding. "Rooms forgive faster than people," she observed. "Chairs have the advantage of not having parents." She smiled without bitterness when she said it. In her other hand, the small cigar made its neat blue commentary. We talked, at last, about the boy's future. Dahl's book she did not use the name, but I knew it sat somewhere behind her eye, had taught her that certain changes do not reverse, that love must, therefore, learn new furniture. She would take him home to Norway after the English errands, she said. There would be ladders built to a bed, stairs carved for window ledges, a tiny walking stick for days when old bones need reminding, a life that refuses to apologize for dimensions. "He will live," she said simply, "and he will work. We will unbutton coats in places where buttons have bitten." The hotel around us approved. A decent house always approves the sentence, "We will live." But we still wonder whether order owes more loyalty to truth than to reputation, whether our polished discretion becomes treachery when it is kept too long, whether a ledger that records brooms and teas should also record days when conscience put on its coat and went out. We still wonder whether comfort without courage is only a waiting room for harm. I allowed myself one small theology. In places like ours, the divine is measured in kettles that boil when asked, in chairs that bear weight they did not anticipate, in staff who choose the gentler broom. If there is an absolution for managers, it is written in the ways we make a building merciful while keeping it open for trade. I would not presume to sermonize beyond that. At tea, the pianist found a march and played it at the mildest volume until even the complaints kept time. A couple who had quarrelled quietly all day reconciled over Battenberg, cut into squares that looked like architecture. A child asked whether mice sleep with their eyes open. A maid answered that proper mice sleep properly, and that the impolite ones are only drawings. The room laughed because drawings can be edited. As the lamps came on, I checked once more the locked drawer where the bottle lay wrapped, and the ledger's copy waited like a spine. I added to them the hat with no name and the hairpins, not because evidence would be needed in a court, but because my museum of small things requires a witness or two when the building tells its grandchildren what happened. I allowed myself the superstition of placing my hand upon the drawer like a blessing. I ended the day at the front steps, watching the street learn darkness. The tide was building its moon argument again. It always wins by returning. Through the revolving door came ordinary questions, a request for a sewing kit, an inquiry about the last post, a compliment to the porter's bow. The grandmother crossed the lobby on the way to her room with the steady gait of someone who never arrives late to her purpose. She lifted the cigar in salute. I bowed on behalf of the house. In the pocket diary, I wrote one line before turning out the lamp. We did not confuse quiet with peace today. Then I returned the book to its shelf and gave the building over to night watch. Who knows the recipe for lullabies? Tomorrow would claim its share of endings. Tonight, the Excelsior managed the only miracle it can promise. It kept sleep possible. Morning arrived with the tact of a butler who knows the house has cried in the night. I walked my first circuit as I always do, front steps to lobby, lobby to lounge, lounge to corridor, touching the brass as if checking a patient's pulse. The Excelsior breathed evenly. Cups chimed without flinching. The pianola accepted its role at the first request. The lilies, stubborn in their innocence, kept to their white. We had persuaded the building back into its older grammar, but a new word lived in the margins, and I could feel it watch me turn the pages. At the writing table, the grandmother had stacked her last notes, copies of telegrams sent at dawn, a penciled route to sweet shops whose windows would not, after today, be tempted by imported jars, a short list of hotel managers whose phones would ring before lunchtime. The 2 cages waited like annotated commas. Bruno already busy with raisin arithmetic, the boy upright, whiskers forward, bearing that quiet one acquires when listening has become a vocation. She greeted me with a nod that contained both fatigue and the kind of certainty found on maps. I will go north first, she said, and write east while I travel. Letters arrive more bravely than old bones. She laid a hand on the towel-wrapped bottle and on the ledger copy, then on the small valise of money that villainy had meant for influence and which would now purchase stamps, tickets, and the gentle conspiracies of decent people. We shall borrow a few offices, she added, with the candour of mountain weather and the use of a teapot. wherever we find one. We spoke once more of the private room and the ledger upstairs, and the boots in which authority had forgotten its toes. I contributed my modest museum, the pin from a wig, the hat with no name, the blue smudged napkin. She contributed the sentences that made such items instruments instead of curiosities. Together they formed a history that would not fit inside a headline. She thanked me with her eyes for having stood, when standing mattered, between a boot and a boy. Before she left, we made the house promise 3 things in its soft brass voice. First, that privacy would continue to serve the shy and not the cruel. Second, that staff would keep a larger definition of orderone that makes room for truth, when truth is small. Third, that 2 mice who were not pests would be treated as guests until plans could take the shape of trains. I called for a dignified birdcage, our handsomest from a prop trunk. Housekeeping lined it with fresh muslin, and the porter hung a tiny water cup as if blessing a chapel. Bruno's parents sent word from the station no address, only the velocity of indignation. In their absence, grief became simple work. We arranged a corner in the grandmother's room where the 2 small travellers could contemplate a window and learn the schedule of gulls. The chef packed a box the size of decency, cheese, bread, a coil of string for tightrope morale, and a square of cake to sweeten any station. The barman contributed a thimble, clean enough to dignify milk. The pianist slipped in a postcard of the pier and wrote on it very carefully for journeys. But we still wonder whether a house can remain good when its goodness is asked to be brave, whether the oath to spare guests alarm must bend, for the older oath that refuses to spare them harm, whether calm is a cure or only a dressing until the surgeon arrives. We still wonder whether the smallest bodies, whiskered, beating like thumbs against linen, teach us the scale on which promises are kept. I loosen the air as any steward of rooms must. A honeymoon couple in the bistro practiced signatures with their new surname and laughed at the letters that would not join hands. A girl at the concierge desk asked if the sea has a bedtime. The porter replied that it dozes with one eye open. A gentleman from Bath wrote a complaint about the weather and then folded it into a paper boat, which the bellboy launched from the fountain with a salute. For a whole minute the lobby belonged to such foolishness, and the minute did its work. Just before noon we rehearsed the departure. The grandmother checked tickets the way a captain checks ropes. The boy lifted his face to the bars with that steady composure I have seen over chessboards. He seemed to be committing the lobby to memory columns. Palms, the faint scratch in the third stair, the chandelier's habit of holding its breath before it flickers. Bruno, generous of hunger, accepted a raisin and attempted to divide it into 2 equal philosophies. The staff gathered without appearing to gather. In good houses, farewells are performed without applause. We did not speak of miracles, we spoke of errands. She would stop at 2 addresses in town, the sweet shops whose names the ledger confessed, to ask respectful questions that carry the weight of a police letter without the uniform. She would write to Whitby before the train reached Southampton. She would borrow the telephone of a manager in York and the patience of a minister in Manchester. "We will not frighten children," she said. "We will educate adults." I provided 2 more letters of introduction on Excelsior paper, the sort that can open a back office faster than a badge when stamped properly. she smiled. "Brass with a conscience," she said. "It is rare, but it shines longer." She asked me at the last for a very specific courtesy. "If in days to come someone asks what happened here," she said, "tell them that order met courage and did not quarrel." I promised. We shook hands, manager and grandmother, two custodians of institutions, hotel, and childhood that survive by making strangers feel less alone. Then I did what I have done 1,000 times for guests who were not leaving with a ledger and the country's luck in their bag. I walked them to the door. The cab drew up with the tact learned by drivers who understand that certain journeys begin in silence. The porter lifted the valise. I lifted the cage with the boy. She lifted Bruno. For a second, the cages sat together on the cab's back seat, bars touching like palms through a fence. Their whiskers made the faintest duet. She seated herself, smoothed her coat, and fixed me with the sort of look that turns oaths into muscle. "We will write," she said. "Not stories. Reports." I bowed for the house. The cab's door closed with the soft authority of a good sentence ending. They went. I stood a moment longer than etiquette asks. The town had taken up its weekday noises. Gulls rehearsed their lawsuits. A newspaper headline insisted that history had happened elsewhere. The sea announced the time without looking at a clock. When I turned back into the lobby, I brought the outside with me a necessary draught and let it mix with polish and tea. There remained the business of surviving the tenderness of endings. I visited the private room one last time. It smelled now only of furniture. The windows had invented a new blue for the afternoon. On the dais, the water jugs waited to be jugs again. I closed the door, an ordinary door, and put the key in my pocket, where keys go to learn humility. At my desk, I opened the drawer that holds contradictions. The bottle wrapped in towel, the ledger copy spined with purpose, the hat with no name. I touched them one by one and returned them to the dark they deserved until daylight could use them again. The afternoon steadied. The council certificate hung where nervous eyes could find it. The band rehearsed a gentle foxtrot as if burnishing the hour. The chambermaids made beds with the charity we normally reserve for widows. I sent a brief note to head office that will read like prudence to anyone who has not watched a ballroom exhale a spell. I wrote a longer note for myself, my second diary, the one no auditor will see. Then I went to the door because a gentleman had arrived with a suitcase that believed itself heavier than it was. And that, too, is a form of magic a house must master. As evening lowered itself like a velvet rope, I walked the perimeter and counted the lights. The excelsior kept time with me. In the lounge, the pianist began. A nightingale sang in Berkeley Square, and the room, obedient as a congregation, remembered how to breathe on the first bar. At the writing table, where two small cages had made a plan into furniture, there remained only the faint imprint of muslin and the crease of an envelope where a hand had leaned too hard. I straightened the blotter and left it imperfect, because some marks are blessings, and now because a conclusion is a duty as much as an art, I will end softly, as a housekeeper closes a door without waking the sleeper. We restored chairs and wiped thresholds and taught plates to keep their cheerful clink. Yes. But we also widen the meaning of order by the width of 2 whiskered lives. A manager is paid to polish brass. On rare days, he is asked to polish conscience. If you should return to the Excelsior in some season when the windows remember salt and the lilies remember sun, you will find us much as we were, polite, punctual. Punctuality's small jokes, but also changed in the way timbers change after a storm. Stronger because they have learned their own bending. There will be letters and trains and shopkeepers who look at their jars as if jars could answer, and managers in other towns who will lend their telephones like lanterns. There will be parents who learn, some quickly and some not at all, that love is not a contract with height. There will be boys who listen and boys who eat, and women who smoke small cigars while counting tides on paper. And there will be rooms that forgive faster than people, and by forgiving, teach people how. The world is untidy. Our work is to keep it hospitable without making it dishonest. But we still wonder whether we will recognize the next day that asks us to choose between reputation and truth, between the locked door and the listening ear, between a tidy statement and a decent act. Perhaps the answer is only this: to keep a key in one pocket and a promise in the other, and to know which one to offer first. Take a quiet breath with me before the band begins. Think of teaspoons and telegrams, of lilies and ledgers, of children who become small without becoming less. Think of the tide arguing kindly with the shore and winning by returning. If you pass our portico one evening and smell polish and salt, you will know the house is keeping faith. And if you hear, in the hush between songs, the faintest whisper of whiskers, do not be afraid. It is merely the building remembering to be brave.